Hey guys, tonight we begin with something colder than your ex's heart. Everything you think you know about Easter. The eggs, the bunnies, the chocolate, the pastel colours, spoiler alert, none of it has anything to do with what you were told in Sunday school. Before you get too comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe if you're enjoying this. A huge thank you to everyone who suggested this topic. You made this happen. We're now live on Spotify, so check the description for the link. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Somehow, it's always 2 a.m. somewhere, and honestly, that's the perfect time to realise your entire childhood was a pagan marketing scheme wrapped in a religious bow. Now dim those lights, switch on a fan for that soft white noise, get comfortable, and maybe grab a chocolate bunny because by the end of this, you're going to need comfort food. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered why a rabbit, a mammal, is somehow responsible for delivering eggs? Or why are we dyeing eggs in the first place? What do eggs have to do with resurrection? Why is Easter on a different date every year like some cosmic roulette wheel? And who looked at spring and thought, you know what this needs? More pastel purple? Could you explain to a confused alien why we hide eggs for children to find while simultaneously telling them a giant bunny did it? Would you believe me if I told you that Easter's date is determined by the moon, just like ancient pagan festivals? And why does the Easter bunny never get the same credit as Santa, even though he's clearly working just as hard? And now, congratulations, you've just woken up in the 40th century CE. Christianity is spreading like wildfire, but so are 1,000 other traditions, rituals, and spring festivals that absolutely refuse to die. Good luck figuring out which came first, the theology or the egg. Let's start with the name itself, because Easter doesn't sound very Christian, does it? It sounds old, ancient even, like something whispered around a fire before Jesus was even born. And that's because it probably was. The Venerable Bede, an 80th century English monk with too much time on his hands, claimed that Easter came from Eostra, a Germanic goddess of spring and fertility, whose festival happened around the same time Christians celebrated the resurrection. Picture this, a deity associated with rebirth, dawn, renewal, and probably a few rabbits hopping around for good measure. The church, ever practical, looked at this popular spring celebration and thought, why fight it when we can rebrand it? So they did. Now, here's where it gets messy. Nobody can actually prove Eostra existed. Bede mentions her once, just once, in a text written 300 years after Christianity had already steamrolled through Europe. No statues, no temples, no inscriptions, nothing. Some scholars think Bede made her up or confused her with another goddess, or just assumed there must have been a spring goddess because, well, every culture had one. The Germans had their dawn goddess Ostara, the Greeks had Eos, the Romans had Aurora. Spring goddesses were like boy bands in the ancient world, everywhere, slightly different, but fundamentally the same. But whether or not Eostra was real, the name stuck. In English and German, Easter kept its pagan-sounding title. Meanwhile, most other languages went with variations of Pascha derived from Passover, which actually makes theological sense. The French say Pâques, Italians say Pasqua, Spanish speakers say Pasqua, but English, we went full pagan branding. It's like if Christmas were called Saturnalia, and everyone just shrugged and kept the name because it sounded nice. The early church wasn't stupid. They knew you couldn't just ban beloved festivals without causing riots. So instead of cancelling spring celebrations, they absorbed them. Eostra's festival became Easter. The eggs people were already decorating got blessed by priests. The feasts people were already throwing got rebranded as resurrection parties. It was brilliant marketing. You get to keep your traditions, but now they're about Jesus. Everybody wins, except, historical accuracy. And let's be honest, this wasn't unique to Easter. Christmas absorbed winter solstice festivals. All Saints' Day swallowed Samhain. The church was a master of cultural appropriation, taking pagan rituals, slapping a Christian label on them, and calling it holy. It worked. People got to keep their parties, and Christianity got to spread without as much bloodshed. Well, less bloodshed than usual. So when you say Happy Easter, you might be invoking a goddess who may or may not have existed, whose festival may or may not have happened, but whose name definitely survived because some monk in the 80th century thought it sounded better than Happy Pascha. The resurrection of Jesus got rebranded with a pagan goddess's name, and nobody thought twice about it. That's not faith. That's marketing genius. And it's been working for over 1,000 years. Eggs have been symbols of life, rebirth, and fertility since humans figured out that chickens were useful for more than just noise. Ancient Persians painted eggs for Nowruz, their spring new year. Egyptians buried eggs in tombs. Romans gave eggs as gifts during spring festivals. Eggs were everywhere, and they all meant the same thing. Life begins again. When Christianity rolled into town, it didn't invent the egg symbolism, it just baptized it. Suddenly eggs weren't about spring anymore. They were about Jesus rising from the tomb. Same shell, different story. Think about it. An egg is a perfect metaphor for resurrection. It looks dead, just a smooth, lifeless stone of calcium, but crack it open and there's potential for life. Birds hatch, omelettes happen. It's transformation in a shell. Ancient cultures understood this instinctively. They didn't need theology to see that eggs represented birth, renewal, and the cyclical nature of existence. Spring was when birds laid eggs, flowers bloomed, and everything that had been dead all winter suddenly exploded back to life. Eggs were the universal symbol of we survived. So when early Christians needed symbols for their new holiday, they looked around and saw eggs everywhere, already being decorated, already being gifted, already deeply embedded in spring rituals across Europe, Persia, and beyond. The church didn't fight it. They just said, okay, eggs are now about Jesus. The stone rolled away from the tomb. That's like cracking an egg. New life emerging. That's resurrection. You're welcome. It was a theological stretch, but it worked. In medieval Europe, eggs took on new meaning during Lent, the 40 days before Easter, when Christians were supposed to fast. Meat, dairy, and eggs were forbidden. But chickens don't care about Lent. They keep laying eggs regardless of your religious commitments. So by the time Easter arrived, people had a massive surplus of eggs and a burning desire to eat something that wasn't salted fish and stale bread. Easter became Egg Day, a celebration of finally being allowed to eat the things that had been piling up for 6 weeks. And because humans love making things fancy, people started decorating eggs. At first it was simple, dye them red to symbolize Christ's blood. Then it got competitive. Intricate patterns, gold leaf, wax designs. Ukrainian pisanki eggs are basically Fabergé-level art made by peasants with too much time and a lot of pent-up creativity. Eggs became status symbols. The fancier your egg, the holier you seemed, or at least the more impressive at church on Sunday. By the time eggs made it to America, they'd been stripped of most religious meaning and turned into pure fun. Kids dyed them with food colouring, hid them in the yard and smashed them together to see whose was strongest. The symbolism? Lost. The enjoyment? Absolutely intact. Eggs had come full circle, from sacred pagan symbol to Christian metaphor to secular decoration. They survived every cultural shift because at their core, they're just universally appealing, portable, decorative, edible, and weirdly satisfying to dye bright colours. That's the Easter egg in a nutshell. Or, an eggshell. Long before Easter existed, spring was party time for pagans across Europe. Festivals honouring fertility, agriculture, and the return of light after winter were massive, loud, and deeply rooted in survival. People danced, feasted, sacrificed animals, lit bonfires, and celebrated the earth waking up. These weren't quaint little gatherings. They were essential cultural events. When Christianity tried to replace them, it quickly realized that people don't just give up their parties. So instead of cancelling spring, the church absorbed it, layered Christian meaning on top, and hoped nobody noticed. Spoiler, everybody noticed. Let's talk about Beltane, the Celtic festival marking the beginning of summer. It involved fire, lots of fire. Bonfires blazed on hilltops, cattle were driven through the flames for purification, and young couples disappeared into the woods for, let's say, fertility rituals. It was sensual, primal, and absolutely not compatible with Christian modesty. The church condemned it, banned it, threatened excommunication, and yet people kept celebrating. Because when you've been dancing around fires and making out in the forest for 1,000 years, a priest telling you to stop isn't very persuasive. Or take the Roman festival of Hilaria, dedicated to Cybele, a mother goddess. It happened in late March, right around Easter time, and involved processions, feasting, music, and general mayhem. Participants mourned the death of Attis, Cybele's lover, then celebrated his resurrection 3 days later. Sound familiar? Early Christians in Rome saw this and must have thought, well, this is awkward. Their resurrection story was happening at the same time as a pagan one, in the same city, with remarkably similar themes. The church couldn't erase Hilaria, so it just kept scheduling Easter nearby and hoped converts would gradually forget which resurrection they were celebrating. The Germanic tribes had their own spring madness. Equinox festivals involve feasting, decorating with flowers, and, you guessed it, eggs. They honoured gods of fertility, thanked the earth for not killing them during winter, and prepared for planting season. It was practical and spiritual at once. When Christian missionaries arrived, they didn't tell people to stop celebrating spring. They just said, hey, keep the flowers and eggs, but now they're about Jesus. It was the ultimate bait and switch, and here's the thing. It worked. Because people wanted it to work. Converts didn't want to lose their traditions. Christianity offered eternal salvation, which was great, but it didn't offer bonfires, dancing, or communal feasts, so the church compromised. You can keep your spring festivals, but we're renaming them. You can keep your eggs, but now they symbolize Christ's tomb. You can keep your rabbits, but now they represent, honestly, we're still not sure, but they're staying. This wasn't unique to Europe. Across the world, spring festivals persisted under new names. The church became a master of syncretism, blending pagan and Christian traditions until they were inseparable. Easter is the perfect example. Strip away the Christian narrative and you're left with an ancient spring festival. Strip away the pagan symbols and you're left with a theological claim that doesn't need eggs or bunnies. But together they created a holiday that survived 2,000 years because it gave people what they needed: hope, community, and an excuse to eat too much after a long, dark winter. Easter doesn't have a set date, and that's because it's tied to something older than the Gregorian calendar, the lunar cycle. Early Christians wanted Easter to align with Passover, which follows the Jewish lunar calendar. But they also wanted it to always fall on a Sunday, because that's when Jesus supposedly rose. The result? A bizarre formula decided at the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE that makes Easter fall on the first Sunday after the first full moon after the spring equinox. Got that? Neither did most people in the 40th century. It's astronomy, theology, and compromise all baked into one confusing holiday date. Let's break it down. First, you need the spring equinox, March 20th or 21st, when day and night are equal length. That's your starting point. Now wait for the next full moon. Not the full moon before the equinox, not the one during, the one after. Once that full moon appears, you wait for the next Sunday. That Sunday is Easter. Simple, right? Except the full moon used to be calculated using ancient lunar tables that didn't always match the actual moon. So sometimes Easter was celebrated when there wasn't even a full moon visible. Oops. The Council of Nicaea wanted uniformity. Before 325 CE, different Christian communities celebrated Easter on different dates. Some followed the Jewish calendar exactly, others didn't. Fights broke out, not physical ones, but theological shouting matches that lasted decades. Emperor Constantine got tired of the chaos and called a council to settle it once and for all. Bishops from across the Roman Empire gathered, debated, and eventually agreed on the Sunday after the full moon after the equinox rule. It was a compromise nobody loved, but everybody accepted because Constantine had an army and a very short temper. But it didn't end there. The formula works mostly, except when it doesn't. Because lunar calendars and solar calendars don't align neatly, Easter can fall anywhere between March 22nd and April 25th. That's a 5-week range. Imagine if Christmas could be anywhere between December 1st and January 50th. Chaos. And yet Christians have lived with this for nearly 2 millennia, because changing it would require another council, and nobody wants to deal with that paperwork. Then, in 1582, Pope Gregory XIII reformed the Western calendar, creating the Gregorian calendar we use today. It fixed some astronomical drift, but Eastern Orthodox churches refused to adopt it. They kept the older Julian calendar, which means their Easter falls on a different date, sometimes a week later, sometimes a month. So now we have 2 Easters, depending on whether you're Catholic, Protestant, or Orthodox. Jesus rose once, but apparently we celebrate it twice. And here's the kicker. None of this is in the Bible. Jesus didn't leave instructions on when to celebrate his resurrection. Early Christians just picked a time that made sense, near Passover, on a Sunday, and then spent 300 years arguing about the details, the lunar, calculation, the equinox rule, the avoidance of Passover overlap. It's all human invention, a blend of astronomy, politics, and religious identity. Easter's date isn't divinely ordained. It's a compromise reached by exhausted bishops who just wanted to go home. So next time someone asks why Easter moves around, you can explain the formula. Or just say, it's complicated, because honestly it is. The church tied Easter to the moon, the equinox, and a Sunday, creating a holiday that dances through the calendar like it's got somewhere to be but can't remember where. It's frustrating, confusing, and perfectly fitting for a holiday that's equal parts Jewish tradition, pagan symbolism, and Christian theology. Nothing about Easter makes sense, and somehow that's exactly why it works. Easter didn't appear in a vacuum. It emerged directly from Passover, the Jewish festival commemorating the Israelites' escape from Egypt. Jesus' Last Supper was a Passover meal. His crucifixion happened during Passover week. For early Christians, many of whom were Jewish, Easter and Passover were inseparable. But as Christianity distanced itself from Judaism, sometimes violently, the connection became uncomfortable. The church wanted Easter to be its own thing, distinct and superior. But the timing, the symbolism, the lamb imagery, it's all still there, a historical shadow the church can't quite shake. Passover is about liberation. God freed the Israelites from slavery in Egypt, and they celebrated by sacrificing lambs and marking their doorposts with blood so the angel of death would pass over their homes. It's visceral, bloody, and deeply tied to survival. The lamb wasn't just symbolic, it was dinner. You ate the sacrifice. When Jesus celebrated Passover with his disciples, he wasn't inventing something new. He was participating in a ritual Jews had practiced for over 1,000 years. But then Jesus died during Passover, and everything shifted. His followers, grieving and searching for meaning reinterpreted the festival through his death. Jesus became the Passover lamb, the ultimate sacrifice whose blood saved humanity. The imagery fit perfectly. Too perfectly. It was as if Jesus' crucifixion had been timed to align with Jewish theology, making it easier for Jewish converts to accept him as the Messiah. Whether this was divine planning or narrative convenience depends on who you ask. For the first few decades, early Christians celebrated Easter as part of Passover. They were Jews who believed in Jesus, so they kept Jewish traditions. But as the movement spread to non-Jews, Gentiles, the connection became a problem. Gentile converts didn't care about Jewish festivals. They hadn't grown up slaughtering lambs or fleeing Egypt. Passover meant nothing to them, and more importantly, the church wanted to establish itself as separate from Judaism, not an offshoot. Keeping Easter tied to Passover made Christianity look like Judaism's little sibling, and church leaders weren't having it, so they made Easter its own thing. At the Council of Nicaea, bishops decided Easter should never coincide with Passover. If the two overlapped, Easter was pushed to the following Sunday. It was a deliberate break, a way of saying, we're not Jewish anymore. But the irony is that Easter's timing is still determined by the Jewish lunar calendar. You can't calculate Easter without referencing Passover. The church tried to sever the connection, but it's baked into the formula. Easter will always be Passover's shadow. And the symbolism? Still Jewish. The lamb, the blood, the themes of sacrifice and liberation. It's all Passover imagery repackaged. Christians eat lamb on Easter, not because it's traditional Christian food, but because of Passover. Churches light candles during the Easter Vigil, echoing the Jewish practice of lighting candles at sunset. Even the word Paschal, used in liturgy, comes from Pesach, the Hebrew word for Passover. Easter is Passover in a Christian costume, no matter how hard the church tries to pretend otherwise. This uncomfortable overlap has fueled centuries of tension. During the Middle Ages, Easter became a time of anti-Jewish violence. Christian mobs accused Jews of killing Christ, conveniently forgetting that Jesus was Jewish and that Romans did the actual executing. Pogroms erupted during Holy Week. Jews were forced to stay indoors. The church preached love and resurrection on Sunday, then turned a blind eye to violence against Jews on Monday. The proximity of Easter and Passover made the hatred more intense, as if Christians resented being reminded of their religion's Jewish roots. Today, the connection is less violent, but still awkward. Christian theologians acknowledge Easter's Jewish origins, but emphasize the differences. Passover is about physical liberation. Easter is about spiritual salvation. Passover looks backward to Egypt. Easter looks forward to heaven. It's a way of honouring the connection while maintaining distance. But every year, when Easter and Passover overlap, the truth becomes unavoidable. Easter wouldn't exist without Passover. Christianity was born from Judaism, and no amount of theological rebranding can erase that. The lamb, the timing, the symbolism, it's all still there. A reminder that Easter's roots run deep into a tradition the church spent centuries trying to outgrow. Rabbits don't lay eggs. Let's just get that out of the way. Yet somehow, the Easter bunny became the mascot of a holiday about resurrection. Why? Because rabbits are prolific breeders, and in pagan Europe they symbolized fertility and spring's explosive return to life. The hare was sacred to Eostra, the spring goddess. When Christianity co-opted the holiday, the rabbit came along for the ride, awkwardly hopping into a religious narrative where it made zero biological sense. By the time German immigrants brought the Osterhus tradition to America in the 1700s, the Easter bunny was already an unstoppable cultural force. Logic didn't matter. The bunny was here to stay. Let's appreciate how absurd this is. You have a story about Jesus dying and rising from the dead, heavy, theological, world-altering stuff. And somehow, the mascot for this event is a fluffy mammal known primarily for humping and hopping. It's like if Christmas were represented by a squirrel. Cute, sure, but also completely random. The Easter Bunny has no connection to Christ, the crucifixion, or anything remotely biblical. He's just there, delivering eggs he biologically cannot produce, and everyone's fine with it. The rabbit's association with spring makes sense if you've ever seen rabbits in spring. They breed constantly. One female rabbit can have multiple litters per year, each with several babies. By March and April, the fields are overrun with baby bunnies. To ancient Europeans, this explosion of life symbolized fertility, renewal, and nature's resilience. If you wanted to represent spring in animal form, rabbits were the obvious choice. They weren't holy, they were horny. But in a way that felt celebratory, not scandalous. In Germany, the ostrich was a gift bringer, like Santa, but for spring. Children would build nests out of grass and leave them in gardens, hoping the magical hare would fill them with coloured eggs. Parents, of course, were the ones doing the filling, but kids didn't question it. The tradition was charming, harmless, and required zero theology. When German immigrants brought it to Pennsylvania in the 1700s, it caught on quickly. Americans loved the idea of a magical creature delivering treats. The Easter Bunny became Americanized, bigger, cuter, and increasingly commercialized. By the 20th century, the Easter Bunny was everywhere. Greeting cards, chocolates, mall photo ops. He got his own songs, cartoons, and eventually a movie franchise. He became so dominant that for many children, Easter was more about the bunny than Jesus. Churches tried to push back, reminding people that Easter was about resurrection, not rabbits. But they were fighting a losing battle. The bunny was too cute, too marketable, too ingrained in popular culture. He'd won. And let's talk about the eggs. Why is the Easter Bunny delivering eggs? Bunnies don't even like eggs. They're herbivores. If anything, they'd be terrified of eggs because eggs mean birds, and birds mean predators. But logic has never been part of the Easter Bunny's job description. He's a German folk character mashed together with pagan fertility symbols, baptized into a Christian holiday, and commercialized into oblivion. He's a Frankenstein's monster of cultural appropriation, and somehow he's adorable. The Easter Bunny endures because he fills a need. Easter, theologically, is about death and resurrection, heavy themes for kids, but a bunny delivering chocolate eggs, that's fun, that's accessible, that's something children can get excited about without needing a theology degree. So parents embraced it, churches tolerated it, and candy companies made billions off it. The Easter Bunny isn't going anywhere. He's too embedded, too beloved, too profitable. Jesus may have risen from the dead, but the Easter Bunny rose from obscurity to become one of the most recognizable icons in Western culture. And he did it without laying a single egg. For most of history, Easter eggs were real eggs, boiled, dyed, sometimes blessed by a priest. Then, in 19th century Europe, chocolatiers had an idea. What if we made eggs out of chocolate? It was genius. Suddenly, Easter wasn't just a religious observance, it was a consumer event. Chocolate bunnies, cream-filled eggs, candy chicks, it all exploded into a multi-billion-dollar industry. The church didn't object because, frankly, it helped keep Easter relevant. But let's be honest, modern Easter is less about resurrection and more about how much sugar a child can consume before noon. Capitalism didn't ruin Easter, it just made it delicious. The first chocolate eggs appeared in France and Germany in the early 1800s. They were small, solid, and expensive, luxury items for the wealthy. But by the mid-1800s, advances in chocolate production made them affordable for the middle class. English chocolatiers like Cadbury and Fry's began mass-producing hollow chocolate eggs, which were cheaper to make and could be filled with candies or toys. It was a masterstroke. You weren't just buying chocolate, you were buying an experience. The egg became a surprise package, a treasure to crack open. Kids loved it. Parents loved it. Chocolate companies became very, very rich. Then came the Easter bunny made of chocolate. Solid, sitting upright, ears perked, ready to be decapitated by a gleeful child. The chocolate bunny became an Easter staple, right alongside eggs. It didn't matter that bunnies have nothing to do with resurrection. They were cute, they were mouldable, and they sold. By the 20th century, Easter had become one of the biggest candy-selling holidays of the year, second only to Halloween. Chocolate eggs, marshmallow chicks, jelly beans, Easter candy was everywhere, marketed with pastel packaging and spring imagery that had zero religious content. The church could have fought this. They could have condemned the commercialization, preached against materialism, reminded people that Easter was about sacrifice, not sugar, and some did. But most churches stayed quiet because chocolate eggs brought people to Easter. Families who hadn't been to church all year suddenly showed up on Easter Sunday, dressed in new clothes, kids clutching baskets of candy. Was it ideal? No. But it was attendance. And in a world where fewer people cared about religion, churches took what they could get. Chocolate companies didn't need theology. They needed marketing, and Easter was perfect. Spring imagery, pastel colours, themes of renewal and joy, it all translated beautifully into advertising. Cadbury's cream eggs became iconic with their gooey fondant centres. Reese's peanut butter eggs outsold their regular cups. Peeps became a cultural phenomenon despite tasting like sugary foam. Easter candy wasn't just profitable, it was a tradition. Families bought the same chocolates every year, creating rituals around brands. That's not religion, that's brand loyalty. And it's arguably more powerful. Today, Americans spend over $2 billion on Easter candy annually. That's more than Valentine's Day, more than any holiday except Christmas and Halloween. The religious meaning has been buried under chocolate foil and plastic grass. Most kids don't know why they're hunting eggs, or why a bunny brought them. They just know it's fun, it involves candy, and their parents seem weirdly invested in taking photos. Easter has become a secular spring festival, with Christian branding, held together by chocolate and tradition. And here's the thing, that's fine. Holidays evolve. They always have. Easter started as a pagan spring festival, got baptized into Christianity, and now exists as a hybrid of religion, commerce, and childhood joy. Chocolate eggs didn't ruin Easter. They just gave it a new purpose, bringing families together, even if the reason is sugar instead of salvation. Capitalism didn't kill Easter. It made it sweet enough to survive. Hot cross buns, those sweet spiced rolls with a cross on top, are an Easter tradition that predates Christianity. Ancient Greeks and Romans made similar buns to honour their gods. The cross, originally a pagan symbol representing the 4 quarters of the moon, or the 4 seasons. When Christianity adopted them, the cross conveniently became about Jesus. People believed these buns had magical properties. They could cure illness, protect sailors, and never go mouldy if baked on Good Friday. Spoiler, they absolutely can go mouldy. But the tradition stuck, and now we eat slightly stale, cross-marked bread every spring while pretending it's holy. The ancient Greeks baked small cakes marked with crosses for Artemis, goddess of the hunt. Romans did the same for Diana. These weren't communion wafers. They were offerings meant to secure divine favour. The cross symbol was everywhere in pre-Christian Europe, carved into stones, woven into textiles, pressed into bread. It wasn't about Jesus. It was about symmetry, balance, and probably some long-forgotten cosmological belief that made sense at the time. The church saw these buns and thought, we can work with this. By medieval times, hot cross buns had been fully Christianized. The cross now represented Christ's crucifixion, and the spices, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, symbolized the spices used to embalm his body. Heavy symbolism for a breakfast pastry, but medieval Christians loved layering meaning onto everything. Baking hot cross buns on Good Friday became a ritual. You made them at dawn, blessed them, shared them with family, and sometimes hung one from the kitchen rafters for good luck. Yes, people kept year-old buns hanging in their homes. Why? Because they believed it would ward off evil spirits and prevent fires. Did it work? Of course not. But traditions aren't about logic. They're about continuity. The superstitions around hot cross buns were wild. Sailors took them on voyages, believing they'd protect against shipwrecks. Farmers buried them in fields to ensure good harvests. Sick people ate them, convinced they'd cure everything from plague to indigestion. The buns became talismans, objects of power imbued with holiness simply because they were baked on the right day with the right symbol. It's remarkable how quickly food becomes magic when you add religion and sugar. In England, hot cross buns became so popular that Queen Elizabeth I passed a law restricting their sale to Good Friday, Christmas, and funerals only. She was worried they were becoming too secular, too commercial, and losing their sacred meaning. The law didn't last. People baked them anyway because you can't legislate taste. But the fact that a queen felt the need to regulate bread shows how culturally significant these buns had become. They weren't just food, they were identity. Today, hot cross buns are everywhere come Easter. Grocery stores stock them for weeks, sometimes starting in January, which feels offensively early. They're mass-produced, often stale, and the cross is usually just icing piped on top rather than dough. The magic is gone. Nobody believes they'll cure illness or protect ships. We eat them because it's tradition, because they taste okay with butter, and because supermarkets need something to sell between Valentine's Day and summer. But here's what's fascinating. People still buy them. Even non-religious people pick up hot cross buns around Easter, because it feels like the right thing to do. The symbolism may be dead, the superstitions forgotten, but the ritual endures. We eat cross-marked bread in spring because our grandparents did, and their grandparents before them, stretching back through centuries of Christians, pagans, Greeks, and Romans. The buns have outlived empires, survived religious upheavals, and persisted through commercialization. Not bad for a spiced roll. Hot cross buns are Easter's quiet miracle, not because they're holy, but because they refuse to disappear. If we strip away centuries of artwork, theology, and Hollywood drama, what actually happened at the crucifixion? Jesus of Nazareth, a Jewish preacher causing trouble in Roman-occupied Judea, was arrested, tried, and executed via crucifixion, a common, brutal Roman punishment for rebels and slaves. It wasn't special. Thousands were crucified. But his followers believed something extraordinary happened afterward. He rose from the dead. That claim, resurrection, became the cornerstone of Christianity. Without it, Easter doesn't exist. But historically we have no eyewitness accounts, no physical evidence, just stories written, decades later by believers. The crucifixion happened. Everything after that, that's faith. Let's start with what we know. Jesus was executed during Passover, probably around 30 to 33 CE, under Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea. He'd been preaching for a few years, gathering followers, upsetting religious authorities, and making vague claims about the kingdom of God. Whether he claimed to be the Messiah outright is debated, but someone thought he was dangerous enough to kill. The Romans didn't execute people for theology, they executed them for sedition. Calling yourself a king in Roman territory, even a spiritual king, was treason. That's why the charge hung above Jesus' cross read, King of the Jews. It wasn't theology, it was mockery. Crucifixion was designed to be slow, public, and humiliating. Victims were stripped, nailed, or tied to wooden beams, and left to hang until they suffocated, bled out, or died from shock. It could take hours or days. Jesus, according to the Gospels, died relatively quickly, within 6 hours, which was unusual. Some scholars suggest he was already weak from flogging, stress, or dehydration. Others point out that Gospel accounts were written decades later and may have been dramatized. Either way, crucifixion was horrific, and Jesus endured it alongside 2 other criminals. He wasn't special to the Romans. He was just another problem solved. What happened next is where history ends and faith begins. The Gospels say Jesus was taken down from the cross, wrapped in linen, and placed in a tomb belonging to Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy follower. A stone was rolled across the entrance. Guards were posted. 3 days later, women, led by Mary Magdalene, found the tomb empty. Jesus appeared to his disciples, alive, bearing wounds but somehow transformed. He stayed for 40 days, then ascended into heaven. This is the story Christians have believed for 2,000 years. But here's the problem. None of this is independently verified. Roman records don't mention Jesus' resurrection. Jewish historians of the time, like Josephus, mention Jesus' execution, but nothing about him rising from the dead. The Gospels were written 40-70 years after the crucifixion by people who weren't there. They're based on oral traditions, second-hand accounts, and theological interpretation. That doesn't mean they're lies, but it does mean they're not historical documents in the way we'd understand today. They're testimonies of faith, not eyewitness reports. Skeptics offer alternative explanations. Maybe Jesus didn't die on the cross, he was taken down alive, revived, and his followers believed it was resurrection. Maybe the disciples stole the body and lied about it. Maybe the women went to the wrong tomb in their grief. Maybe the resurrection was a spiritual experience, not a physical one, and later Christians literalized it. Or maybe, this is the hardest one for non-believers to swallow, maybe it actually happened. Maybe a man died, decomposed, and came back to life, defying every law of biology and physics. That's the claim, and it's unprovable either way. What we do know is that something happened that convinced a small group of terrified, grieving Jews that their executed leader was alive. That belief spread despite persecution, despite logic, despite the fact that resurrection was considered absurd even in the ancient world. Within a few decades, communities across the Roman Empire were worshipping a crucified Jew as a god. Within a few centuries, Christianity was the dominant religion of Europe. That transformation doesn't prove resurrection, but it proves something powerful happened in the days after Jesus died. Whether that something was supernatural or psychological, we'll never know for certain. History can tell us Jesus was crucified. Faith has to handle the rest. Jesus wasn't the first God to die and come back. Resurrection myths were everywhere in the ancient world. Osiris in Egypt was killed, dismembered, and resurrected. Dionysus was torn apart and reborn. Persephone descended into the underworld and returned every spring. These weren't seen as literal events, but as allegories for seasonal cycles: death in winter, rebirth in spring. Early Christians knew these myths. Critics even accused them of plagiarism. The Church's response? Our resurrection is real. Theirs were just stories. But the themes, death, rebirth, renewal, were universal because they mirrored nature itself. Easter tapped into something humans already understood. Life always returns. Let's start with Osiris, one of the oldest resurrection myths on record. In Egyptian mythology, Osiris was a king who brought civilization to Egypt. His brother Set, jealous and murderous, killed him, chopped his body into pieces and scattered them across the land. Osiris's wife Isis searched for the pieces, reassembled him, and through magic brought him back to life, sort of. He couldn't return to the living world fully, so he became the god of the underworld, ruling over the dead. It's a resurrection, but not a happy one. Osiris lives again, but in a different realm, forever changed. Sound familiar? Then there's Dionysus, the Greek god of wine, madness, and ecstasy. Depending on which version you read, Dionysus was torn apart by titans, boiled in a cauldron, or struck by lightning. Either way, he died violently, but Zeus, his father, saved his heart and either resurrected him or birthed him again. Dionysus became a twice-born god, associated with cycles of death and rebirth. His followers celebrated with wild, ecstatic festivals that involved drinking, dancing, and sometimes tearing animals apart. It was messy, chaotic, and deeply spiritual. The Greeks didn't see it as literal history. They saw it as a metaphor for the vine cut down in winter, bursting back to life in spring. Persephone's story is even closer to Easter's timing. She was abducted by Hades and dragged into the underworld. Her mother Demeter, goddess of the harvest, mourned so deeply that the earth turned barren, winter. Eventually a deal was struck. Persephone would spend part of the year with Hades and part with her mother. When she returned to the surface, spring bloomed. Her descent and return became the mythological explanation for seasons. Greeks celebrated her return every spring with festivals, offerings, and rituals. It was resurrection as natural law. Death gives way to life, over and over, forever. These myths weren't unique to Greece and Egypt. The Mesopotamians had Tammuz, a shepherd god who died and was mourned annually. The Phrygians worshipped Attis, who died and was resurrected 3 days later during spring festivals. The Canaanites told stories of Baal defeating death and returning to life. Across the ancient Near East and Mediterranean, resurrection myths followed the same pattern. A god or hero dies, the world mourns, and life returns triumphantly. These stories were tied to agriculture, to survival, to the hope that no matter how harsh the winter, spring would come again. When Christianity emerged, it was into a world already saturated with dying and rising gods. Early critics, like the philosopher Celsus, mocked Christians for believing their resurrection was different from everyone else's. "You're just copying Osiris," they said. Christians pushed back hard. Theirs wasn't myth, it was history. Jesus was a real person who died and rose at a specific time and place. The others were symbolic. Jesus was literal. That distinction mattered to them, even if outsiders didn't see much difference. But here's what's undeniable. Christianity's resurrection narrative resonated because it fit into a pre-existing framework. People already understood the symbolism of death and rebirth. They'd been celebrating it for millennia. Easter didn't invent resurrection. It claimed to be the one true resurrection in a world full of symbolic ones. Whether that claim is true depends on faith. But the fact that resurrection myths are universal suggests something deeper. That humans have always needed to believe death isn't the end, that life is stronger than death, and that spring always, always comes again. Easter is just the latest version of a very old story. And maybe that's not plagiarism. Maybe it's proof that some truths are so fundamental, every culture tells them in their own way. Good Friday is the darkest day in the Christian calendar. It's the day Jesus was tortured, mocked, and executed, and yet it's called good. Why? Theories vary. Good might mean holy, or it's good because Jesus' sacrifice redeemed humanity. Either way, it's a strange name for a day of state-sanctioned murder. For believers, Good Friday is about suffering, sacrifice, and the depth of divine love. For historians, it's about Roman governance, Jewish religious authorities, and one man caught in the middle. Churches hold solemn services. Some Christians fast, others reenact the crucifixion with disturbing realism. It's a day that refuses to be forgotten, even if it makes everyone uncomfortable. The term Good Friday likely comes from God's Friday, or an old use of good meaning holy, but honestly, calling it good feels like calling a funeral a party. It's the day everything falls apart. Jesus, who spent 3 years healing the sick and preaching about love, gets arrested, beaten, and killed. His followers scatter. His movement seems finished. If you were a disciple on that Friday afternoon, watching your teacher die on a cross, good would not be the word you'd use. Catastrophic, maybe. Soul-crushing, definitely. But good? That only makes sense in hindsight. After Sunday, after resurrection. Good Friday is only good if Easter happens. Churches treat Good Friday with appropriate gravity. Services are solemn, often held at 3 p.m., the hour Jesus supposedly died. The cross is unveiled, sometimes draped in black cloth. Worshippers kneel, pray, and meditate on suffering. Some congregations reenact the stations of the cross, walking through each stage of Jesus' final hours. In the Philippines, some devotees take it further, literally getting nailed to crosses in public reenactments that make Western churches deeply uncomfortable. It's devotion taken to an extreme that blurs the line between faith and masochism. Then there's the fasting. Good Friday is one of the few days Christians are still encouraged to fast, eating only 1 full meal and 2 smaller ones. The idea is to participate in Jesus' suffering through minor discomfort, which seems almost insulting when you consider what actual crucifixion entails. But the gesture matters. It's about solidarity, about not treating this day like any other Friday. You're supposed to feel something: grief, guilt, gratitude. Churches work hard to make Good Friday uncomfortable because comfort feels inappropriate. And the silence. Many Christians observe silence from noon to 3 p.m., marking the hours Jesus hung on the cross. No music, no talking, just quiet reflection on mortality, sacrifice, and the idea that God himself experienced human suffering. It's heavy. For believers, it's the emotional low point of the entire year, the valley before the mountain of Easter Sunday. You can't skip Good Friday and jump straight to resurrection. The theology doesn't work that way. You have to sit with death first. But here's the strange part. Good Friday only exists because Easter exists. If Jesus stayed dead, Good Friday would just be that awful Friday we don't talk about. It's only called good because of what comes next. The suffering has meaning only in retrospect, only if Sunday delivers. Without resurrection, Good Friday is just tragedy. With resurrection, it's sacrifice. That's the bet Christianity makes, that this day of horror was actually the hinge of history, the moment God took on the worst humanity could offer and transformed it into salvation. For non-believers, Good Friday is a reminder of how brutal Roman justice was, how religious and political power collide violently, and how a single execution can echo through millennia. For believers, it's the day love proves stronger than death, even if it took 3 days to show up. Either way, Good Friday refuses to be ignored. It sits there in the calendar, heavy and dark, demanding we acknowledge that Easter's joy is built on Friday's grief. Good is a weird word for it, but maybe that's the point. The Easter Vigil is Christianity's oldest and most dramatic ritual. It begins after sunset on Holy Saturday, the day between death and resurrection, and stretches into Easter Sunday. Churches are pitch black. A single candle is lit, representing Christ as the light entering the darkness. Then, one by one, every candle in the church is lit from that flame until the entire space glows. It's theatrical, emotional, and deeply symbolic. For early Christians, this wasn't just a service, it was a rehearsal for the end of the world, a moment when light conquers death. Modern congregations still hold vigils, though fewer people attend. Sitting in the dark, waiting for dawn, feels too slow for our instant gratification world. But that's the point. Holy Saturday is the forgotten day, the in-between. Jesus is dead. The disciples are hiding. The tomb is sealed. Nothing is happening. It's the longest day in Christian theology, a day of pure absence where God himself is silent. The Easter Vigil sits in that silence and refuses to rush past it. You're not allowed to jump straight to resurrection. You have to sit in the dark and wait. Early Christians took this seriously. They fasted all day, gathered at nightfall, and stayed awake until dawn, marking the transition from death to life in real time. The service begins outside, often around a bonfire. A priest lights the Paschal candle, a massive pillar of wax representing Christ, and processes into the pitch-black church. Congregants follow, holding unlit candles. As the priest walks down the aisle, he stops 3 times chanting, "The light of Christ," and each time more candles are lit. By the time he reaches the altar, the entire church flickers with hundreds of tiny flames. It's primal, ancient, and genuinely moving, even if you don't believe a word of the theology. Light-filling darkness is a metaphor humans understand instinctively. Then comes the exulte, an ancient hymn sung by a deacon or priest. It's long, poetic, and weirdly beautiful, calling the night blessed and praising bees for making the wax of the Paschal candle. Yes, bees. Medieval Christians had a thing about bees. The hymn describes this night as more important than any other, the night when Christ broke the chains of death and rose triumphant from the grave. It's epic, operatic, and if you're sitting in a dark church surrounded by candlelight, it works. The vigil creates atmosphere the way few modern religious services do. After the exulte, there are readings, lots of them. The story of creation, the flood, the Exodus, the prophets. It's a crash course in the entire Bible, showing how Easter is the culmination of everything that came before. Early Christians sat through 7 to 12 readings, which sounds exhausting but makes sense. They were literates in a mostly illiterate world, hearing their sacred stories aloud, connecting Easter to the grand arc of salvation history. Modern vigils shorten the readings because people have work in the morning, but the structure remains. You're walking through all of history to arrive at this one moment. Then, just before midnight or dawn, the tone shifts. The lights come on, bells ring, alleluias erupt. It's Easter. Christ is risen. The priest announces the resurrection with joy bordering on mania, and suddenly the sombre, candlelit vigil transforms into a full celebration. Flowers appear, music swells, people embrace. If the church does baptisms, this is when they happen. New believers, literally rising from water as Christ rose from the tomb. It's baptism as resurrection, rebirth mirroring the resurrection narrative. For people who attend, the vigil is exhausting and transcendent. You've been there for hours, you're tired, you've sat through long readings in a dark church, and then boom, Easter. The payoff feels earned because you waited for it. You didn't just show up Sunday morning in a pastel dress and call it good. You sat with death, you waited in darkness, and you witnessed light returning. That's the vigil's power. It doesn't tell you Easter happened. It makes you experience the transition from death to life, even if only symbolically. Most Christians skip the vigil. It's too long, too late, too much commitment. They'll show up Sunday morning for the abbreviated version with donuts and upbeat hymns, but the vigil remains, quietly, for those who want the full experience. It's Christianity at its most ancient and strange, a ritual that hasn't been focus grouped or modernized into irrelevance, and in a religion increasingly watered down to feel comfortable and convenient. The Easter Vigil stands as a reminder that some things are worth waiting for in the dark. Easter Sunday is the climax, the moment Jesus' tomb is found empty and his followers proclaim he's alive. Gospel accounts vary on the details, who got there first, what they saw, who they told, but the message is clear. Death lost. For Christians, this is the most important day of the year, more significant than Christmas. Churches fill with lilies, choirs sing triumphant hymns, and pastors deliver sermons about hope and eternal life. For non-believers, it's a day off work and maybe some brunch. But either way, Easter Sunday marks a turning point, the day a small Jewish sect became a world religion. Whether you believe it happened or not, the impact is undeniable. The Gospel accounts of Easter morning are messy. In Matthew, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary visit the tomb and encounter an angel who rolls away the stone. In Mark, 3 women arrive, find the stone already moved, and meet a young man in white who tells them Jesus has risen. In Luke, the women find the tomb empty, 2 angels appear, and the male disciples don't believe them. In John, Mary Magdalene goes alone, sees the stone moved, runs to tell Peter and John, and later encounters Jesus himself, whom she mistakes for a gardener. The details don't match. Different women, different angels, different reactions. This bothers some people. It reassures others. If the accounts were identical, critics would cry conspiracy. Because they differ, believers argue they're authentic. Eyewitness testimonies naturally conflict on details while agreeing on the core truth. What everyone agrees on, the tomb was empty. How that happened is where faith and skepticism diverge. Christians say resurrection. Jesus' body was miraculously restored to life, transformed, glorified. Skeptics offer alternatives: grave robbery, wrong tomb, hallucinations, legend developing over decades. But here's what's strange. The first witnesses were women. In first-century Judea, women's testimony wasn't legally valid. If you were inventing a resurrection story, you'd have male disciples discover the empty tomb. But the Gospels put women front and centre, Mary Magdalene especially. That detail suggests either remarkable historical accuracy or a narrative choice so counterintuitive it accidentally preserved truth. Easter Sunday changed everything for early Christians. Before the resurrection, they were a scattered, traumatized group of Jesus followers hiding from authorities. After Easter, they became bold, public, and willing to die for their belief that Jesus was alive. Within weeks, Peter, who denied Jesus 3 times, was preaching openly in Jerusalem, risking arrest. Within decades, Christian communities sprouted across the Roman Empire. Within centuries, Christianity was the dominant religion of Europe. That transformation requires explanation. Either they genuinely believed Jesus rose, or they pulled off history's most successful con, dying for something they knew was false. Most historians think genuine belief is the simpler explanation, even if they don't share that belief. Easter Sunday services are the opposite of Good Friday's solemnity. Churches explode with joy. White and gold vestments replace purple and black. Hymns like Christ the Lord is risen today get belted out with enthusiasm bordering on aggression. Alleluia is shouted repeatedly after being banned during Lent. Pastors grin like they've got insider information on the best news ever. And flowers. So many flowers. Lilies everywhere, symbolizing purity and resurrection, filling churches with a sense so strong it borders on overwhelming. Easter Sunday is Christianity's victory lap, the day they get to say, "See, we told you death wasn't the end." For families, Easter Sunday often has little to do with Jesus and everything to do with tradition. There's the Easter outfit, new clothes symbolizing renewal, but also an excuse to dress up and take photos. There's the Easter brunch, often more important than the church service, featuring ham, deviled eggs, and passive-aggressive family dynamics. There's the egg hunt, where children tear through backyards hunting for plastic eggs filled with candy, while adults drink mimosas and pretend to supervise. It's chaotic, joyful, and almost entirely secular, and that's Easter's tension in a nutshell. For believers, it's the day God conquered death and offered humanity eternal life. For non-believers, it's a pleasant spring day with chocolate and family. Both groups celebrate, but they're not celebrating the same thing. The resurrection either happened or it didn't. There's no middle ground. But Easter has carved out space for everyone. The devout praying in churches, the skeptics enjoying a long weekend, the kids just happy about candy. Easter Sunday is many things to many people. But one thing's certain, 2,000 years later, that empty tomb, real or imagined, still commands attention. The Gospels agree on one thing. Jesus' tomb was empty on Sunday morning. But why? Christians say resurrection. Skeptics offer alternatives. The body was stolen, moved, or never buried there in the first place. Roman guards supposedly watched the tomb, but who were they really? Why would authorities allow an executed criminal a proper burial? Some scholars suggest Jesus' body was thrown into a common grave, as was typical for crucifixion victims. The empty tomb became the linchpin of Christian faith, but historically it's one of the hardest claims to verify. Faith doesn't need evidence, history does, and history is frustratingly silent. Let's start with the burial itself. The Gospels say Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy follower of Jesus, requested the body from Pilate and placed it in his own unused tomb. This was unusual. Crucifixion victims typically weren't given proper burials. Their bodies were left on crosses for days, then tossed into common pits where they'd decompose with other criminals. Allowing a family or follower to claim the body was rare, granted only as a favour or political gesture. So why would Pilate allow it? Some scholars think Joseph was a Sanhedrin member with connections, able to negotiate. Others think the burial story was invented later to fulfill Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah being buried with the rich. Then there's the stone. Gospel accounts describe a large stone rolled across the tomb's entrance, heavy enough that several women worried they couldn't move it. But tombs in 1st century Judea didn't usually have rolling stones. They had square stones propped against openings or simple wooden doors. Rolling stones were expensive, reserved for the wealthy. If Jesus was buried in Joseph's tomb, maybe it had one. Or maybe the detail was added to make the story more dramatic. Rolled away stone sounds miraculous. A removed wooden plank sounds mundane. The guards are even more problematic. Matthew's Gospel mentions Roman soldiers posted at the tomb to prevent disciples from stealing the body. But Mark, Luke, and John don't mention guards at all. If guards were there, why do only one Gospel record it? And if they were Roman soldiers, why would Pilate waste manpower guarding a dead preacher's tomb? Unless Jewish authorities convinced him the body might be stolen to fake a resurrection. But that requires them taking Jesus' resurrection claims seriously before he'd even risen, which seems unlikely. Some historians think the guards were added to Matthew's narrative to counter early accusations that disciples stole the body. So what happened? If we assume the empty tomb is historical, the explanations break down into natural and supernatural. Natural, the body was moved to another location, and the women went to the wrong tomb in the dark. Or disciples did steal the body, creating the resurrection story to keep the movement alive. Or Jesus didn't actually die, he passed out, revived in the cool tomb, and walked away. This swoon theory was popular in the 90th century, but requires ignoring the brutality of Roman crucifixion. You don't survive being nailed to wood and stabbed with a spear. Supernatural, resurrection. Jesus' body was transformed, glorified, brought back to life in a way that transcended biology. It's the explanation Christians accept and skeptics reject. There's no middle ground. Either the supernatural exists and intervened that Sunday morning, or it doesn't, and something else explains the empty tomb. The empty tomb doesn't prove resurrection. It just proves absence, and absence can be explained 1,000 ways. But here's what's undeniable. Early Christians genuinely believed the tomb was empty and Jesus was alive. They didn't act like people covering up a hoax. They preached openly, risked execution, and died claiming, Jesus rose. You can argue they were mistaken, delusional, or experiencing mass hallucinations, but they believed it. The empty tomb, whether historical fact or powerful myth, launched a religion that reshaped the world. And 2,000 years later, we're still arguing about it. That's not proof of resurrection, but it's proof that something happened in Jerusalem that first Easter morning, something so disruptive, so transformative, that history bent around it. What the something was, we'll probably never know for certain. But the empty tomb remains, a question carved in stone, waiting for an answer we can't quite give. According to the Gospels, Mary Magdalene was the first person to see the risen Jesus. Not Peter, not John, Mary, a woman whose testimony wouldn't have been legally valid in first century Judea. And yet there she is, centre stage in Christianity's most important moment. For centuries the Church downplayed her role, sometimes slandering her as a prostitute. She wasn't. But recently scholars have reclaimed her as a crucial apostle, a leader, and possibly Jesus' closest follower. Her presence at the empty tomb challenges patriarchal narratives and highlights how revolutionary early Christianity actually was, at least until men took over and rewrote the story. Mary Magdalene appears in all four Gospels, always present at critical moments: the crucifixion, the burial, the resurrection. She's not a background character, she's central. The Gospels call her Mary of Magdala, a town on the Sea of Galilee, distinguishing her from the many other Marys in Jesus' circle. Luke mentions that Jesus cast 7 demons out of her, which sounds dramatic, but probably just meant he healed her of illness, physical or mental. Demon possession was the first century explanation for conditions we'd now call epilepsy, mental illness, or chronic pain. Whatever afflicted her, Jesus healed her, and she became one of his most devoted followers. She funded his ministry. Luke lists her among the women who supported Jesus' movement financially, meaning she had resources, independence, and agency. She wasn't a prostitute. That lie came later, in 591 CE, when Pope Gregory I conflated Mary Magdalene with other women in the Gospels, an unnamed sinner who anointed Jesus' feet, and Mary of Bethany. Why? Probably because it was easier to diminish a powerful woman by labelling her a reformed prostitute than to acknowledge her as an apostle. The Catholic Church officially retracted this in 1969, but the damage was done. For over 1,000 years, Mary Magdalene was remembered as a repentant whore, not as the apostle to the apostles, and that title, apostle to the apostles, is significant. In John's Gospel, after Mary encounters the risen Jesus, he tells her, "Go to my brothers and tell them." She does. She becomes the first person to proclaim the resurrection, making her, by definition, the first Christian preacher. But Paul, writing later, lists resurrection appearances to Peter, James, and 500 brothers. He doesn't mention Mary. Why? Because her testimony, as a woman, didn't carry weight. Paul wasn't being intentionally sexist. He was being strategic. He was writing to convince skeptical audiences, and a woman's testimony wouldn't persuade them. So Mary was erased, written out of the official resurrection narrative, even though the Gospels put her first. Early Christian texts outside the Bible give Mary even more prominence. The Gospel of Mary, a 2nd century text, portrays her as a leader among the disciples, someone Jesus loved and taught secret knowledge. Peter, jealous and dismissive, questions why Jesus would confide in a woman. Levi, possibly Matthew, defends her, saying, "If the Saviour made her worthy, who are you to reject her?" It's a remarkable snapshot of early Christian gender politics. Women leading, men resenting it. The text wasn't included in the Bible, likely because it made male church leaders uncomfortable. Mary Magdalene was dangerous. She represented a version of Christianity where women held authority, preached, and led communities. As the church became institutionalized, patriarchal and hierarchical, that version became unacceptable. So Mary was slandered, sidelined, and reduced to a repentant sinner weeping at Jesus' feet. It took nearly 2,000 years for her reputation to be rehabilitated. Now, scholars recognize her as the first evangelist, the witness who started it all. Churches are slowly honoring her properly. Pope Francis elevated her feast day to match the male apostles. Some denominations now call her equal to the apostles. But here's the most fascinating part. The fact that Mary Magdalene is in the Gospels at all, as the first resurrection witness, is powerful evidence that the story wasn't fabricated. If you were inventing a resurrection narrative in first century Judea, you'd never make a woman the first witness. It would undermine your credibility immediately. The fact that the Gospels include her, despite the cultural disadvantage, suggests the writers were recording what actually happened, even if it didn't fit their society's expectations. Mary was there. Mary saw. Mary told. And for that she was erased, rewritten, and ignored for centuries. But she survived. And now, finally, she's being heard. Easter lilies are everywhere in churches come spring, pure white, trumpet-shaped, symbolizing purity and resurrection. But here's the thing. Lilies are funeral flowers. They're associated with death, mourning, and graveyards. Their strong scent was originally used to mask the smell of decay. So why are they the flower of Easter? Because resurrection requires death first. The lily symbolism is perfect. Beauty emerging from death, life after the grave. It's Christianity in floral form. Also, they bloom in spring, they're expensive, and they photograph well, which didn't hurt their popularity. Faith and aesthetics, hand in hand. The Easter lily we know today, Lilium longiflorum, isn't even native to Europe or America. It came from Japan and the Ryukyu Islands, where it grew wild and was appreciated for its beauty but held no religious significance. Missionaries and traders brought bulbs to England in the 1800s, and horticulturists immediately saw potential. The lily bloomed in late spring, had pure white petals symbolizing purity, and its trumpet shape could be interpreted as angels announcing the resurrection. It was almost too perfect. By the late 19th century, Bermuda was mass-producing Easter lily bulbs for export to America and Europe, creating an entire industry around a flower that had nothing to do with Christianity just decades earlier. Then World War I disrupted the supply. Japan had been the primary exporter of lily bulbs, but wartime shipping issues cut off the supply. American growers, seeing an opportunity, started cultivating lilies domestically, particularly along the coast of Oregon and California. By the 1940s, the US was producing its own Easter lilies, and they'd become so entrenched in Christian tradition that most people assumed they'd always been there. Nobody remembered they were recent imports. Churches filled with lilies every Easter, and the flower became as synonymous with resurrection as eggs and bunnies, more sacred than bunnies at least. But the lily's association with death predates Easter. In ancient Greece and Rome, lilies were planted on graves, symbolizing the soul's restored innocence after death. In Christian art, lilies appear in depictions of the Virgin Mary, representing her purity, and in images of saints, symbolizing their virtuous deaths. The flower's scent, sweet, heavy, almost cloying, was useful in medieval funerals to cover the smell of decomposing bodies before embalming became common. Lilies became death flowers, grief flowers, grave flowers, so when they were adopted for Easter, they brought that association with them. Easter lilies don't ignore death. They acknowledge it, and then insist life is stronger. Churches love lilies because they're expensive and dramatic. A single potted Easter lily can cost $15 to $30, and churches order them by the dozens. Families often sponsor lilies in memory of deceased loved ones, placing small cards with names next to the pots. It's a way to honor the dead while celebrating resurrection, bringing the funeral flower into the sanctuary on the day death was supposedly defeated. The lilies sit at the altar, on windowsills, lining the aisles, creating a visual and olfactory wall of white. It's beautiful, excessive, and faintly overwhelming, like spring itself. There's also a practical reason lilies dominate Easter. They can be forced to bloom on schedule. Growers manipulate temperature and light exposure to ensure lilies bloom in late March or April, regardless of when they naturally flower. This makes them reliable for Easter services, unlike wildflowers or other spring blooms that might be early or late. Churches need predictability. The resurrection happened on a specific Sunday, and the flowers better show up too. So we've industrialized Easter lilies, bending nature to fit liturgical calendars, which feels oddly appropriate for a holiday that claims death itself was defeated on schedule. But here's the irony. Most Easter lilies don't survive. People buy them, display them for a week, then let them die. They're treated as decorations, not living plants. The bulbs could be planted outdoors and bloom for years, but few people bother. Easter lilies are disposable, one-time use resurrection symbols thrown away after they've served their purpose. There's a metaphor in there somewhere about how we consume Easter, how we treat sacred symbols as seasonal decorations, how beauty is temporary and we're okay with that. The Easter lily blooms, symbolizes resurrection, smells like memory and funerals, and then it's gone. Just like Easter itself, intense, brief, and over before you know it. And next year we'll buy new ones because that's tradition. Death, resurrection, repeat. Easter parades began as post-church strolls where Christians showed off their Sunday best, new clothes symbolizing renewal and rebirth. By the 19th century, especially in America, Easter became a full-blown fashion event. Women wore elaborate hats, Easter bonnets, men donned new suits, and families paraded down Fifth Avenue in New York like it was a runway. It had nothing to do with Jesus, and everything to do with status, spring, and showing off. Churches initially encouraged it as a way to draw crowds, but eventually the parades overshadowed the service. Now Easter is as much about brunch and outfits as it is about resurrection. The tradition of wearing new clothes at Easter has roots in early Christianity. Newly baptized converts wore white robes on Easter Sunday, symbolizing their spiritual rebirth. This practice extended to all congregants. Easter was a day to appear fresh, renewed, cleansed. By medieval times, wearing new clothes at Easter was both a spiritual statement and a social expectation. If you could afford it, you bought or made new garments to mark the occasion. If you couldn't, you at least washed and mended your old ones. Easter was the one day you tried not to look poor. In Victorian England and America, Easter fashion became competitive. The Industrial Revolution made fabrics cheaper and more accessible, so middle-class families could participate in trends once reserved for the wealthy. Women's Easter bonnets became elaborate works of art. Broad-brimmed hats decorated with flowers, ribbons, feathers, and sometimes entire taxidermied birds. Yes, dead birds, perched on hats. Fashion was weird. The phrase Easter bonnet entered popular culture, immortalized in Irving Berlin's song Easter Parade, which had nothing to do with religion and everything to do with showing off your hat. By the early 1900s, Easter parades were major social events. New York's Fifth Avenue parade became legendary. After church services, thousands of people strolled the avenue in their finest clothes, greeting neighbors, admiring outfits, and being seen. It was part religious observance, part fashion show, part class performance. Wealthy families wore custom-tailored suits and gowns. Working-class families wore their best and tried to blend in. Everyone understood the unspoken rules. Easter was about looking successful, put together, and blessed. Your outfit was a statement about your standing before God and man. Churches didn't object because full pews are full pews. If the promise of showing off a new dress got people into church, pastors weren't complaining. Some sermons even referenced the new clothes, drawing parallels to spiritual renewal. Just as you've clothed your body in new garments, they'd say, clothe your soul in righteousness. It was a stretch, but it worked. Easter attendance soared, and churches benefited from the cultural momentum of the parades, even if the theology got lost somewhere between the sanctuary and Fifth Avenue. By the mid-20th century, Easter parades had evolved into pure spectacle. Department stores promoted Easter sales aggressively, turning the holiday into a shopping event. Families bought coordinated outfits, matching dresses for daughters, tiny suits for sons, corsages for mothers. The fashion aspect completely overshadowed the religious one. People attended church to be seen, not to worship. The parade was the main event. Jesus' resurrection became background music to a spring fashion show. Today, Easter parades still exist, but they're smaller, more self-aware, sometimes ironic. New York's parade continues, now filled with tourists and people in outrageous costumes, giant bunny ears, flower-covered suits, hats so absurd they're performance art. It's less about piety and more about fun, spectacle and Instagram photos. Churches have mostly given up trying to reclaim Easter fashion as spiritual. If people show up in new clothes, great. If they show up in jeans, also fine. The Easter bonnet isn't a religious symbol anymore. It's a nostalgic relic. A reminder that for a century or so, Christianity and capitalism were so intertwined you couldn't tell them apart. The Easter parade represents everything strange about modern Easter. A religious holiday hijacked by consumerism, tradition without theology, ritual emptied of meaning but preserved out of habit. And yet people love it. The excuse to dress up, to gather with family, to mark the arrival of spring, those things matter, even if they have nothing to do with an empty tomb in Jerusalem. Easter parades are silly, shallow, and weirdly endearing. They're Easter stripped of resurrection and dressed in pastels. And somehow they've survived because looking good in spring will never go out of style. The Easter bunny didn't become a mainstream American icon until German immigrants brought the tradition in the 1700s. In Germany, children built nests for the Osterhaus, Easter hare, to fill with coloured eggs. The tradition seemed quaint, harmless and profitable, so it spread. By the 20th century, shopping malls featured Easter bunny photo ops. Cartoons made him cuddly, and Cadbury turned him into chocolate. He became America's second favourite fictional creature, right behind Santa. The fact that he has nothing to do with Christianity? Irrelevant. He's cute, he sells candy, and kids love him. The Easter Bunny won. The German tradition was straightforward. The Osterhase was a magical hare who judged children's behaviour and left eggs for the good ones. Sound familiar? It's basically proto-Santa logic applied to spring. German immigrant communities in Pennsylvania kept the tradition alive, teaching their children to make nests from bonnets or baskets and leave them out the night before Easter. In the morning, the nest would be filled with dyed eggs and small treats. It was charming, low stakes, and required no theology. Perfect for a holiday increasingly about family, not faith. The tradition spread slowly at first. Non-German Americans found it odd, a hare delivering eggs. That makes no sense. But children loved it, and parents realised it gave them leverage. Be good, or the Osterhase won't come worked as well as any Santa threat. By the late 1800s, American businesses saw opportunity. Greeting card companies started producing Easter cards featuring cute rabbits. Candy makers experimented with rabbit-shaped chocolates. The Easter Bunny was being commercialized before most Americans even knew who he was. Then came the 20th century and mass media. Cartoons, children's books, and advertisements turned the Easter Bunny into a national icon. He got a personality, cheerful, generous, spring-themed. He was drawn wearing bow ties, carrying baskets, surrounded by chicks and flowers. He became less hare, more cartoon mascot, and crucially he became non-threatening. Santa could be scary. He saw you when you were sleeping, which is creepy. But the Easter Bunny, just a friendly rabbit hopping around hiding eggs. No judgment, no naughty list, just candy and fun. By the 1950s, the Easter Bunny was everywhere. Shopping malls hired people to wear bunny costumes and pose with children for photos, creating an Easter version of the Santa lap photo tradition. Except the Easter Bunny costume was somehow more unsettling. Oversized head, fixed grin, dead eyes. Children cried. Parents took photos anyway. It became a rite of passage, the annual photo of a terrified child held by a 6-foot rabbit. And we all just accepted this as normal. Hollywood helped too. Movies and TV specials featured the Easter Bunny as a character, giving him backstories, workshops, and magical powers. He became Santa's spring equivalent, living on Easter Island, no relation to the real island, and managing an army of helper bunnies who painted eggs. None of this was in the German tradition. It was pure American invention, mythology created by marketing departments and children's authors who realized kids wanted Easter to be as magical as Christmas. And it worked. The Easter Bunny became so embedded in American culture that most people can't imagine Easter without him. Churches complained that he distracted from Jesus, but their complaints were drowned out by the sound of cash registers. The Easter Bunny sells. He moves merchandise, fills malls, and gives parents an easy way to make Easter fun for kids who don't care about resurrection theology. He's a commercial success story, a folk character who went mainstream, a bunny who hopped his way into becoming an American institution. The Easter Bunny won because he filled a need. Easter needed a mascot, something friendly and secular that could make the holiday accessible to everyone, not just Christians. The bunny delivered, literally and figuratively. He brought eggs, candy, and childhood magic to a holiday that was becoming increasingly about spring and family, less about crucifixion and empty tombs. Churches could keep their resurrection narrative. America wanted a bunny. And the bunny, improbably, impossibly, became as essential to Easter as anything in the Bible. Maybe more so. Hiding eggs and hunting for them feels like pure childhood fun, but it has deeper roots. Some trace it to pagan spring festivals where eggs symbolized hidden fertility and rebirth. Others say it started as a Christian game symbolizing the search for Jesus. Either way, egg hunts became a staple of Easter celebrations, especially in America. Parents hide plastic eggs filled with candy, kids scramble across lawns, and someone always cries because a sibling found more. It's chaotic, competitive, and has absolutely nothing to do with theology. But it's tradition, and traditions don't need logic, they just need sugar and sunshine. The earliest egg hunts likely weren't organised events but spontaneous traditions. In medieval Europe, eggs were hidden during Easter celebrations and children searched for them. Whether this had pagan origins or was simply a fun game is debated. Eggs were valuable, a protein source, a symbol of spring, something worth hiding and finding. By the 1700s, egg rolling and egg hunting were common in Germany, where children would search gardens for hidden eggs supposedly left by the Osterhaus. It was playful, innocent, and easy to Christianize if needed. The eggs represent new life, and searching for them represents seeking Christ. Done. Theology accomplished. When the tradition came to America, it exploded. Americans love competitions, and egg hunts are inherently competitive. Who finds the most eggs? Who finds the golden egg? Who gets to the prize egg first? It's capitalism in miniature, teaching children that resources are limited and you'd better grab them before someone else does. Parents set rules, older kids start farther back, toddlers get a head start, everyone shares at the end, theoretically. But egg hunts always devolve into barely controlled chaos. Kids sprint across lawns, dive into bushes and occasionally tackle each other over a plastic egg containing 2 jelly beans. It's Lord of the Flies with pastel decor. The White House Easter egg roll, starting in the 1870s, formalized the tradition at the national level. Children roll eggs across the South Lawn using wooden spoons, competing to see whose egg travels farthest without breaking. It's bizarre, charming, and completely pointless, which makes it perfect for a government-sponsored event. Presidents pose with children, photographers snap pictures, and everyone pretends rolling eggs on the White House lawn is a meaningful tradition, and not just something that happened once and stuck because no one knew how to stop it. Modern egg hunts have evolved into elaborate productions. Some communities host massive hunts with thousands of eggs, prize drawings, and helicopter egg drops. Yes, helicopters dropping eggs. Churches organize hunts to draw families, hoping egg-hunting kids will become future congregants. Businesses sponsor hunts as marketing. The eggs themselves are rarely real anymore. Plastic eggs filled with candy, stickers, or small toys. Real eggs are messy, breakable, and smell terrible if left in the sun. Plastic eggs are reusable, customizable, and can be filled with anything from chocolate to tiny biblical tracts, reminding you why you're hunting eggs in the first place. There's also a dark side to egg hunts, the meltdown. Every parent knows that egg hunts can go wrong. A child finds 0 eggs and sobs inconsolably. Another finds 20 and refuses to share. Sibling rivalries ignite. Accusations of cheating fly. Parents who just wanted a cute photo now find themselves mediating a candy-based diplomatic crisis on the front lawn. The egg hunt, meant to be joyful, becomes a stress test for family dynamics. But somehow, every year, we do it again. Because tradition. Critics point out that egg hunts have nothing to do with Christianity, which is true. You can't trace a line from the resurrection of Christ to children scrambling for plastic eggs in a park. But maybe that's okay. Easter, over centuries, has become many things to many people. For some, it's a sacred day of worship. For others, it's a spring celebration with family. For kids, it's eggs and candy. The egg hunt is secular, silly, and joyful, a tradition that survives because it makes people happy. It doesn't need religious justification. It just needs a yard, some eggs, and children willing to run. And as long as sugar and competition exist, egg hunts will endure. Theological meaning optional. Peeps, those neon-coloured marshmallow chicks, are an Easter icon that refuses to die, literally. Invented in the 1950s, they were originally handmade. Now machines pump out millions. They're sweet, they're bright, and they're weirdly indestructible. People have tried to burn them, dissolve them, and microwave them. They puff up horrifyingly. Yet Peeps survive, much like Easter itself. They have nothing to do with resurrection, but they've become a symbol of spring, sugar, and American excess. Some people love them. Most people tolerate them, but every Easter they return, rising from the grocery store shelves like tiny edible phoenixes. Peeps were created in 1953 by Justborn, a candy company in Pennsylvania. Originally, each Peep was handmade using a pastry tube, taking 27 hours to produce. That's dedication to marshmallow chicks. Then the company mechanized the process, reducing production time to 6 minutes. Suddenly, Peeps could be mass-produced, and they flooded the market. They came in yellow, pink, and blue, colors that screamed spring and artificial flavoring. Kids loved them. Adults found them cloyingly sweet and oddly textured, but that didn't stop them from buying millions every year. The Peeps appeal is partly nostalgic. If you grew up eating them, you feel obligated to buy them for your own kids, perpetuating the cycle. They're also visually appealing, bright, cute, and fun to arrange in baskets. You can't have an Easter basket without Peeps. It's basically a rule. But the taste? Divisive. Peeps are sugar-coated sugar with a marshmallow base that's somewhere between foam and rubber. They're not sophisticated candy. They're not even good candy. They're novelty candy, and their survival depends not on flavour but on tradition and brand recognition. Peeps have also become a cultural phenomenon beyond candy. People run experiments on them, microwaving Peeps to watch them expand into grotesque blobs, lighting them on fire to see how long they burn. Answer, disturbingly long. Dissolving them in various chemicals to test their indestructibility. They resist acid impressively well. There are Peep diorama contests where people create elaborate scenes using Peeps, biblical tableaus, movie recreations, historical reenactments. The Peep has transcended its status as candy and become an art medium, which is both ridiculous and oddly impressive. There's also the Peep stale debate. Fresh Peeps are soft, squishy, and bland. Stale Peeps, left open for a few days, develop a harder exterior and chewier texture. Some people prefer them this way, deliberately aging their Peeps like fine wine. Others find this horrifying. The debate rages on Easter forums and social media every spring. Do you eat them fresh or let them harden? It's the kind of low-stakes argument that defines modern Easter, passionate, pointless, and entirely about sugar preferences. Peeps have also expanded beyond chicks. There are now Peeps bunnies, Peeps Christmas trees, Peeps pumpkins, Peeps for every holiday. The company realised they had a year-round product if they just changed the shape. But the Easter chick remains the classic, the original. The Peep purists insist is the only legitimate Peep. Yellow chick Peeps are iconic. Everything else is a cash grab. This is the kind of thing people have opinions about in a world where Easter has become more about products than piety. The indestructibility of Peeps has become part of their mythology. They don't decompose easily. Leave a Peep outside and it'll outlast most organic matter sitting there stubbornly covered in ants, refusing to break down. It's almost admirable. Peeps are survivors. They've survived taste tests, scientific experiments, and decades of people claiming they're disgusting. And yet, every Easter, they return. Store shelves fill with yellow, pink and blue chicks, and despite everything, people buy them. Because Easter without Peeps feels wrong. They're tradition, they're nostalgia, they're spring in edible form. Peeps may be indestructible, but more importantly, they're unavoidable. And in the end, that's all any Easter tradition really needs to survive. Lamb is the traditional Easter meal, and it's not because lamb tastes good with mint jelly, though it does. It's because of Passover. During the Jewish festival, families sacrificed a lamb and marked their doorposts with its blood, so the angel of death would pass over their homes. Christians adopted this imagery, calling Jesus the Lamb of God whose sacrifice saved humanity. Eating lamb on Easter is both a nod to Passover and a symbolic consumption of the sacrifice. It's poetic, layered, and also delicious. But if you're vegetarian, Easter just became awkward. The lamb symbolism runs deep in Christianity, so deep it's almost uncomfortable if you think about it too hard. John the Baptist sees Jesus and announces, "Behold, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world." Not behold, the teacher or the prophet or the really wise guy, the lamb, an animal bred specifically to be killed and eaten. That's the metaphor Christianity chose for its saviour, and it's brutal when you strip away the poetry. Jesus is the sacrifice, the altar is the cross, the blood saves you, and at Easter dinner, you're literally eating lamb while celebrating the lamb. It's layers upon layers of symbolism, or it's just dinner, depending on how much theology you want to digest with your meal. In medieval Europe, lamb wasn't just symbolic, it was practical. Spring lambs were born in late winter, and by Easter were young, tender, and ready for slaughter. Easter coincided with the availability of fresh meat after a long winter of salted, dried, and questionable preserved meats. Families who could afford it slaughtered a lamb for Easter, celebrating both the resurrection and the return of fresh food. The meal was a feast, a luxury, and a theological statement all at once. You thanked God for saving humanity and for making lamb taste better than the jerky you'd been chewing since November. The preparation of Easter lamb became ritualized. In some cultures, the lamb was blessed by a priest before cooking. In others, it was roasted whole, symbolizing the completeness of Christ's sacrifice. Greek Orthodox traditions feature roast lamb cooked on a spit outdoors, turning slowly over coals, the smell of rosemary and lemon filling the air. It's communal, celebratory, and takes all day. A far cry from modern Easter ham pulled from the oven in 2 hours. The lamb wasn't fast food. It was an event, and eating it together reinforced family and faith. But let's talk about the elephant, or rather the pig, in the room: ham. In America, ham has largely replaced lamb as the Easter protein of choice. Why? Because ham is cheaper, easier to cook, and more familiar to American palates. Lamb is expensive, gamey to some people, and requires more culinary confidence. So families switch to ham, a meat with zero theological significance but plenty of practical appeal. Ham is safe. Ham is predictable. Ham comes pre-cooked in a foil pan. Lamb requires effort, and modern Easter is about convenience. The shift from lamb to ham represents a larger trend, Easter losing its specific symbolism and becoming a generic spring holiday. Ham doesn't mean anything, it's just meat. You could serve ham at Thanksgiving, Christmas, a random Tuesday, it doesn't matter. But lamb at Easter carries weight. It ties the meal to Passover, to sacrifice, to the entire theological foundation of the holiday. Eating lamb is participating in a story thousands of years old. Eating ham is just eating ham. Still, in many cultures, Greek, Italian, Middle Eastern, Jewish households celebrating Passover, lamb remains essential. It's tradition, identity, and faith cooked into one meal. The smell of roasting lamb on Easter Sunday is the smell of continuity, of generations doing the same thing in the same way because some things are too important to change. And if you're sitting at an Easter table with roast lamb in front of you, you're not just eating dinner, you're eating theology, you're consuming sacrifice, you're participating in a ritual that stretches back to Egypt, to the first Passover, to the moment when blood on a doorpost meant life instead of death. That's heavy for a Sunday meal, but that's Easter. Nothing about it is simple, not even the menu. In the 22nd century, Christians couldn't agree on when to celebrate Easter. Some wanted it tied to Passover, others to Sunday. The debate got so heated it nearly split the church. Finally, the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE stepped in and declared Easter would always be on Sunday, separate from Jewish traditions. The decision was as much about Christian identity as theology, defining the religion as distinct from Judaism. But even today, Eastern Orthodox churches use a different calendar, so they celebrate Easter on a different date. 2,000 years later, Christians still can't agree on when Jesus rose. Awkward. The controversy, called the Quartodeciman controversy, because nothing says fun church debate like a Latin name, began innocently enough. Early Christians in Asia Minor celebrated Easter on the 40th of Nisan, the Jewish month when Passover occurred, regardless of what day of the week it fell on. They were called Quartodecimans, meaning 14thers. They argued that Jesus died during Passover, so Easter should always align with Passover. Simple, logical, tied to Scripture. What's the problem? The problem was Rome. Christians in Rome and most of the Western Church celebrated Easter on the Sunday following Passover, insisting that since Jesus rose on a Sunday, Easter must always be Sunday. To them, the day of the week mattered more than the calendar date. It wasn't just about timing, it was about meaning. Sunday was the Lord's Day, the first day of the new creation, the day death was defeated. Celebrating Easter on a Tuesday or a Friday felt theologically wrong, like having Christmas in July. The argument escalated. Letters were exchanged. Bishops accused each other of heresy. Pope Victor I, around 190 CE, tried to excommunicate the Quartodecimans, which was the ancient Christian equivalent of unfriending someone. Other bishops told him to calm down. The controversy simmered for over a century, dividing communities and creating separate Easter celebrations depending on which tradition your bishop followed. Imagine attending church on Sunday, celebrating the resurrection, and knowing the church across town is doing the same thing on Thursday. It was chaos. Enter Emperor Constantine. By 325 CE, Christianity was becoming the Roman Empire's favoured religion, and Constantine needed unity, not bickering about calendars. He convened the Council of Nicaea, gathering over 300 bishops to settle major theological disputes, including the Easter question. The council ruled in favour of the Sunday tradition, declaring that Easter would always fall on Sunday and importantly would not coincide with Passover. The decision was deliberate. Christianity needed to separate itself from Judaism. Celebrating Easter on the same day as Passover made Christianity look like a Jewish sect, and church leaders wanted independence. So they built in a buffer, ensuring Easter and Passover wouldn't overlap. But the formula was complicated, and not everyone had access to the astronomical tables needed to calculate Easter correctly. Different regions used different methods, meaning Easter still varied by location for centuries. Some churches celebrated it one week, others the next. The mess continued until the Gregorian calendar reform in 1582, which most Western churches adopted. But Eastern Orthodox churches kept the older Julian calendar, and that's why their Easter often falls a week or more after Western Easter. Same resurrection, different Sundays. The controversy reveals something uncomfortable. Easter's date isn't divinely ordained. It's a compromise reached through arguments, politics, and a desire to distance Christianity from its Jewish roots. There's no verse in the Bible saying, "Celebrate my resurrection on the first Sunday after the first full moon after the spring equinox." The formula is human invention, crafted by bishops who were trying to create unity, but ended up creating a calendar system so confusing it requires advanced math and lunar charts. And even then, they failed. Christians are still celebrating Easter on different dates, 2,000 years later, because apparently arguing about calendars is a core Christian tradition, right up there with prayer and communion. The Quartodeciman controversy is a reminder that church history is messy, political, and often ridiculous. People nearly split Christianity over when to celebrate Easter, not whether Jesus rose, but when. The resurrection was never in question, the date was, and that date, fought over, voted on, and formulated through councils and calendars, still divides Christians today. Every year, Western Christians celebrate Easter, and a week later, Orthodox Christians do the same thing. 2 Easters, 1 resurrection, and an argument that refuses to die. If that's not the perfect metaphor for Christianity's relationship with itself, I don't know what is. Medieval Easter was intense. Churches held elaborate ceremonies featuring giant bells, holy water, and dramatic reenactments of the resurrection. Priests blessed everything: eggs, bread, lambs, even swords. Good Friday was somber. Some Christians whipped themselves as penance. Easter Sunday exploded with joy, feasts, music, and celebrations that lasted for days. But it wasn't all holy. Peasants used Easter as an excuse to drink, gamble, and settle grudges. The church tried to keep it sacred, but medieval people knew how to party. Easter was a chaotic mix of faith, superstition, and spring madness. Let's start with the bells. Church bells were silent from Good Friday through Easter Sunday, creating an eerie, unnatural quiet across villages. The bells were said to have flown to Rome to visit the Pope, which is the kind of explanation you give children who ask too many questions. During this silence, wooden clappers called crotolums replaced bells, making harsh, jarring noises that sounded like the world itself was broken. Then, at the Easter Vigil, the bells returned. They rang out in a cacophony of joy, announcing the resurrection, and the sound was so significant that people believed the bells themselves were holy objects, capable of warding off storms, demons, and misfortune. Holy Saturday was for blessings. A medieval priest blessed everything. Eggs were brought to church by the basketful, blessed by the priest, and taken home as sacred objects. Bread was blessed and saved for months. People believed it could cure illness or protect the home from fire. Lambs were blessed before slaughter, making the Easter meal not just symbolic but sanctified. Some regions even blessed weapons, swords, shields, and armour, because apparently nothing says resurrection like a holy sword. The Church was trying to Christianize every aspect of life, layering sacredness onto the mundane, and Easter was the peak of this impulse. Good Friday was brutal by design. This wasn't a day for comfort. Flagellants, religious extremists who believed suffering brought them closer to God, whipped themselves publicly, their backs bloody, their devotion terrifying. Most Christians didn't go that far, but fasting was mandatory. No meat, no dairy, no eggs, no joy. Churches held tenebrae services where candles were extinguished one by one until the sanctuary sat in complete darkness, symbolizing Christ's death and the world's descent into despair. It was theatre, trauma, and theology combined, designed to make you feel the weight of crucifixion before the relief of resurrection. But Easter Sunday, that was the release. Churches exploded with light, sound, and colour. Candles blazed, bells rang, choirs sang, and priests wore white and gold vestments. The altar, stripped bare on Good Friday, was now covered in flowers, linens, and sacred objects. It was sensory overload, intentional and overwhelming, meant to represent the shock of resurrection, the world turning from death to life in an instant. Congregants who'd been fasting for weeks finally broke their fast with massive feasts. Meat, cheese, eggs, bread, beer, wine. Everything forbidden during Lent was devoured with abandon. It wasn't gluttony, it was celebration, the body and soul both rejoicing. Outside the church, Easter celebrations got rowdy. Villages held festivals with music, dancing, games, and drinking, lots of drinking. The church tried to maintain decorum, but after 40 days of Lenten deprivation, people were ready to cut loose. Fights broke out. Old grudges resurfaced. Easter Monday, the day after Easter, was notorious for pranks, revelry, and general chaos. In some regions, men would douse women with water, symbolizing baptism, they claimed, though it was mostly just an excuse to drench people. In others, people played violent ball games that looked more like street brawls than sports. Medieval Easter also had a dark side. It was a time of heightened anti-Jewish violence. Passion plays, dramatic reenactments of Jesus' crucifixion, often portrayed Jews as villains, stirring up hatred that spilled into the streets. Jewish communities locked their doors and stayed inside during Holy Week, knowing that Christian mobs whipped into religious fervour might attack. The same holiday celebrating resurrection and love became an excuse for persecution and murder. The church condemned the violence, sort of, while also preaching sermons that blamed Jews for Jesus' death. Medieval Easter was a contradiction. Sacred and profane, joyful and violent, holy and horrifyingly human. But for peasants, Easter was survival. It marked the end of winter and the beginning of planting season. It was hope made tangible, warmth returning, food growing again, life renewing after months of cold and hunger. The religious symbolism mattered, but so did the practical reality. Easter meant the worst was over. You'd survived another winter, and if the crops were good, you'd make it to next Easter. The resurrection story resonated not just theologically, but existentially. Life wins, spring comes, death isn't final. For medieval Christians, that wasn't abstract theology. It was lived experience, and Easter was the day they celebrated it with every fibre of their being, sacred and profane alike. The White House Easter egg roll began in the 1870s, when Congress banned Easter celebrations on Capitol Hill's lawn. Too much damage from rowdy kids. President Rutherford B. Hayes opened the White House grounds instead, and the tradition stuck. Now, every Easter Monday, thousands of children descend on the White House lawn to roll eggs down hills with wooden spoons. It's bizarre, wholesome, and completely removed from any religious context. It's also one of the few times the president has to smile and pretend to care about eggs. Politics and pastel dye, what could go wrong? The tradition started by accident. In the 1870s, Washington, D.C. children gathered on the Capitol grounds every Easter Monday to roll hard-boiled eggs down the lawn. It was messy, loud, and destructive. The grass got torn up, eggs smashed everywhere, and groundskeepers complained bitterly. So Congress passed a law banning the practice, thinking they'd solved the problem. Instead, they just relocated it. In 1878, children showed up at the White House gates demanding entry. President Hayes, either charming or cornered, let them in, and the White House Easter egg roll was born. The activity itself is wonderfully pointless. Children use wooden spoons to push hard-boiled eggs across the lawn, racing to see whose egg travels farthest without cracking. There's no skill involved, just chaos and luck. Eggs roll in unpredictable directions. Kids trip over each other. Parents shout encouragement, and Secret Service agents stand nearby looking like they're reconsidering their career choices. It's democracy in action. Messy, inefficient, and somehow endearing. Over the decades, the event grew. First Lady Dolly Madison is sometimes credited with starting it earlier in the 90th century, though records are unclear and Dolly gets credit for a lot of things whether she did them or not. By the early 20th century, the Easter egg roll was a fixture, covered by newspapers and attended by thousands. Presidents posed for photos, waved at children, and occasionally rolled an egg themselves to prove they were relatable. It became a public relations opportunity, a chance for the president to seem warm, family-friendly, and not at all distracted by wars, scandals, or economics. Collapse. The event was cancelled during World War I and World War II to conserve resources and because giant public gatherings felt inappropriate, while young men were dying overseas. It resumed in 1953 under Eisenhower, and every president since has continued it, though some more enthusiastically than others. Richard Nixon held it during Watergate, smiling through gritted teeth while children rolled eggs, and reporters asked if he planned to resign. It's the most surreal combination of innocence and politics, childhood joy happening mere feet from the seat of global power. Modern Easter egg rolls are massive productions. Tickets are distributed via lottery because demand is so high. The South Lawn is transformed into an Easter carnival with music stages, storytelling corners, athletic activities, and celebrity appearances. Companies sponsor booths. Characters in costume roam around. And yes, there are still egg rolls, though they're now a small part of a much larger event. The original activity, kids rolling eggs with spoons, happens in designated areas while most attendees take selfies, collect swag, and pretend they're not just there to see the White House up close. The religious aspect, gone entirely. The White House Easter egg roll is secular spring celebration, patriotism and pastels, a chance for families to participate in a tradition that has nothing to do with Jesus and everything to do with American civic ritual. Churches don't organise it. Prayers aren't said, it's just eggs, children, and a president fulfilling a duty that started because Congress didn't want their lawn ruined. And somehow, it's become one of the most enduring Easter traditions in America, proving that sometimes the weirdest accidents become the most permanent institutions. Jesus may have risen from the dead, but wooden spoons and hard-boiled eggs conquered the White House lawn. History is strange. Easter Island wasn't named for chocolate eggs or resurrection. Dutch. Explorer Jacob Roggeveen arrived on Easter Sunday 1722, saw giant stone heads, moai, and shrugged, calling it Easter Island. The island's actual name is Rapa Nui, and its history is fascinating. Polynesian settlers, ecological collapse, and mysterious statues. But thanks to one lazy explorer, the island is forever tied to a Christian holiday it has zero connection to. It's like naming a place Tuesday Mountain just because you showed up on a Tuesday. History is full of these weird accidents, and Easter Island is one of the best. Let's appreciate the absurdity. Roggeveen and his crew sailed into the Pacific, landed on a remote island on April 5, 1722, Easter Sunday, and decided that was sufficient reason to name it after the holiday. Never mind that the island had been inhabited for centuries by Polynesian people who called it Rapa Nui. Never mind that it had its own history, culture, and name. Roggeveen looked at the calendar, shrugged, and said, "Easter Island it is." And because Europeans got to write the maps, the name stuck. The Rapa Nui people didn't get a vote. Their island was now permanently branded with a Christian holiday they'd never heard of. The island's real story has nothing to do with resurrection. Polynesian voyagers settled Rapa Nui around 1200 CE, navigating thousands of miles of open ocean in canoes, which is more impressive than anything Roggeveen ever did. They built a thriving society, carved the famous moai statues, massive stone figures representing ancestors, and developed a unique culture. But they also deforested the island, exhausted resources, and by the time Europeans arrived, the population had collapsed. The moai stood silent, facing inland, guarding an island that had already seen its golden age come and go. Roggeveen saw the statues, noted them in his journal, and moved on, leaving behind a name that would confuse people for centuries. The name Easter Island has caused endless confusion. Tourists arrive expecting Easter decorations or religious sites. They find moai instead, giant stone heads staring inscrutably across the landscape. There's no connection between the statues and Christianity, no theological link between Rapa Nui culture and Easter eggs. The name is purely coincidental, a historical accident that became permanent because no one bothered to fix it. It's colonialism in miniature. Show up, ignore the locals, name everything after yourself or your calendar, leave. The Rapa Nui people have tried to reclaim their island's identity. In recent decades, there's been a push to use Rapa Nui instead of Easter Island, to recognise the indigenous name and history, rather than the arbitrary label imposed by a Dutch sailor on a Sunday morning. Some maps now include both names. Tour guides explain the discrepancy. But globally, the island is still known as Easter Island, and most people who visit couldn't tell you why. They just know there are big stone heads, and it's called Easter something, and surely those two things must be related. They're not. The moai were carved centuries before Christianity reached the Pacific, built for ancestor worship, not resurrection theology. There's a certain poetry to the mistake, though. Easter, the holiday, is about resurrection, life emerging from death, renewal after collapse. Rapa Nui's history is about the opposite. A society that thrived, collapsed, and was left with ruins. The moai stand as reminders of what was lost, not what was reborn. So calling it Easter Island is almost tragically ironic. The island's story is one of endings, not new beginnings, of environmental collapse and cultural decline, not triumph over death. Roggeveen named it for a holiday celebrating eternal life. The island itself tells a story about the limits of resources and the consequences of overreach. If there's a resurrection narrative here, it's a cautionary one, but the name endures because that's how history works. Random decisions become permanent. Explorers name things carelessly, and centuries later we're stuck with Easter Island, a name that means nothing to the island's people, and everything to confuse tourists who wonder why there aren't more bunnies. The island survives, the Moai still stand, and the Rapa Nui people continue to fight for recognition and respect. And somewhere, Jacob Roggeveen's ghost is probably annoyed that people keep bringing this up. But here we are, talking about Easter Island in a history of Easter, because one man couldn't be bothered to learn the island's actual name and decided Easter Island was good enough. And that, in a nutshell, is how a lot of history gets made. Lazily, accidentally, and with consequences that last far longer than anyone intended. Easter has fallen during some of history's darkest moments. During World War I, soldiers celebrated Easter in muddy trenches far from home. In World War II, Easter services were held in bombed-out churches. During the Holocaust, Jewish prisoners marked Passover in concentration camps. Knowing Easter, the Christian holiday built on Jewish foundations, was being celebrated by the same people who imprisoned them. The contrast is haunting. A holiday of resurrection observed amid mass death. Easter has always carried this tension, hope in the face of horror, life insisting itself even when the world burns. World War I's Easter of 1916 fell during some of the bloodiest fighting on the Western Front. Soldiers huddled in trenches filled with mud, rats, and the bodies of their comrades, trying to observe a holiday about new life while death surrounded them constantly. Some chaplains held services in dugouts, their voices competing with artillery fire. Men sang hymns between bombardments, clutching makeshift crosses carved from wood scavenged from ruins. Chocolate eggs sent from home arrived crushed, melted, or not at all. Letters written on Easter Sunday spoke of resurrection and hope, then ended up in mud-caked pockets of soldiers who wouldn't live to see May. The Easter Rising of 1916 in Ireland added political rebellion to religious observance. Irish Republicans launched an uprising on Easter Monday, choosing the timing deliberately. Resurrection as revolution, new life for a nation. The rebellion was crushed within a week, its leaders executed, but the symbolism stuck. Easter became intertwined with Irish independence, the holiday's themes of sacrifice and renewal grafted onto nationalist struggle. Churches held services while bullets flew outside. The resurrection narrative became literal and political. Ireland would die and rise again. It's a reminder that Easter's symbolism is never neutral. It can inspire faith or justify violence, sometimes both at once. World War II brought even darker contrasts. Easter 1945 fell just weeks before Germany's surrender, with concentration camps still operating and death marches ongoing. Jewish prisoners in Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen observed Passover in secret, sharing scraps of matzah made from smuggled flour, while Christian prisoners and guards celebrated Easter. The proximity is unbearable to contemplate. Passover, the festival that birthed Easter, being observed by people imprisoned and murdered by a Christian nation celebrating resurrection. The theological irony is so heavy it's almost obscene. Allied soldiers celebrated Easter in foxholes, on ships, in field hospitals. Chaplains held sunrise services on battlefields still smoking from yesterday's fighting. One famous photo shows Marines on Iwo Jima attending Easter services weeks after the island was taken, helmets off, heads bowed, surrounded by the wreckage of war. The resurrection message, life conquers death, must have rung hollow or profoundly true, depending on who you were and what you'd seen. For soldiers who'd watched friends die, Easter either offered comfort or felt like cosmic mockery. In bombed European cities, churches held Easter services in ruins. Walls were gone, roofs collapsed, but congregations gathered anyway among the rubble. In London during the Blitz, worshippers sang hymns while air raid sirens wailed. In Dresden, burned to ash by Allied firebombing, survivors marked Easter in the skeletal remains of the Frauenkirche. The symbolism was inescapable, celebrating resurrection in the literal ruins of destruction, proclaiming life in the midst of death. It was either the most faithful act imaginable or the most desperate, probably both. Vietnam War soldiers received care packages with plastic eggs and stale Peeps. Easter services were held on aircraft carriers, in jungle clearings, at fire bases named after forgotten battles. Chaplains tried to make the holiday meaningful, while helicopters thundered overhead and body bags waited for transport. The disconnect between Easter's message, peace, hope, eternal life, and the daily reality of killing and dying created a cognitive dissonance some soldiers never recovered from. Easter in wartime reveals the holiday's deepest tension. It's about conquering death in a world where death is everywhere, about resurrection when bodies pile up faster than graves can be dug, about hope when hope seems like the cruelest lie. And yet people observed it. Soldiers sang hymns in trenches. Prisoners whispered prayers in camps. Families gathered in bomb shelters and pretended everything was normal. Easter refused to be cancelled by war. Maybe that's faith. Maybe that's stubbornness. Maybe it's the same thing. Either way, Easter survived humanity's worst moments by insisting, against all evidence, that life still matters and death doesn't get the final word, even when it very clearly does. Today's Easter is a hybrid, part religious observance, part commercial extravaganza, part excuse to eat chocolate. Church attendance spikes, then drops immediately afterward. Stores push Easter sales. Families gather for brunch. The Easter Bunny appears in malls, and millions of people dye eggs without knowing why. Easter has become so culturally diluted that its religious roots are barely visible. For Christians, this is either tragic or adaptive. For everyone else, it's just another day off. Easter survived by becoming everything to everyone, sacred and secular, ancient and modern, meaningful and meaningless all at once. Walk into any store in March and you're assaulted by Easter. Pastel everything, pink, yellow, baby blue, lavender. Aisles filled with chocolate bunnies, marshmallow chicks, plastic eggs, artificial grass, baskets in every size. Easter has become a retail season, a 2-month commercial push that starts right after Valentine's Day and doesn't end until the discounted candy hits clearance racks in May. The religious imagery is there if you look, crosses on some decorations. He has risen signs mixed in with bunny merchandise, but it's background noise. The main event is consumption. For many American families, Easter morning follows a script that has nothing to do with church. Kids wake early, find baskets left by the Easter Bunny, who somehow broke into the house overnight without triggering the Ring camera, tear through chocolate, then hunt for eggs hidden around the house or yard. Parents drink coffee, take photos, and marvel that they stayed up until midnight stuffing plastic eggs with candy. Church is optional. Brunch is mandatory. The resurrection gets a brief mention if someone says grace before mimosas and eggs Benedict, but mostly Easter has become spring family day with better snacks. Churches have adapted, sometimes awkwardly. Easter Sunday services are tailored for the Christmas and Easter Christians. People who show up twice a year, need everything explained, and will disappear until December. Pastors preach accessible sermons about hope and new beginnings, Avoiding heavy theology that might confuse or alienate visitors, churches offer coffee bars, kids programs and egg hunts on the lawn after services, blurring the line between worship and entertainment. The goal is twofold: honour the resurrection and maybe convince visitors to come back. Success rate low, but they keep trying. Then there's the fashion element, still alive despite decades of casual dress taking over. Easter Sunday is one of the last occasions where people dress up. New dresses for girls, tiny suits for boys, women in spring dresses and men in pastel ties they'll never wear again. It's performative, Instagrammable, and only loosely connected to religion. You're not dressing up for Jesus. You're dressing up because that's what you do on Easter. It's tradition masquerading as faith, or faith expressed through tradition, depending on your perspective. The secular takeover bothers some Christians deeply. They see Easter losing its meaning, reduced to bunnies and brunch, while the resurrection, the entire point, gets buried under chocolate foil. They're not wrong. For millions of Americans, Easter is a spring holiday with Christian branding, observed out of habit rather than conviction. But here's the thing. That's how holidays survive. Christmas became Santa and presents. Halloween became costumes and candy. Thanksgiving became football and turkey. Holidays evolve or die, and Easter evolved by letting go of some theological purity in exchange for cultural staying power. For non-Christians, modern Easter is wonderfully accessible. You don't need to believe in resurrection to enjoy dyeing eggs with your kids. You don't need church membership to appreciate spring, chocolate, or a long weekend. Easter has become a civic holiday, a cultural touchstone that belongs to everyone, not just believers. It's been democratized, commercialized, and secularized into something that can accommodate any level of religious commitment, from devout to none at all. And maybe that's okay. Maybe Easter's survival required this flexibility. The alternative was becoming a niche religious observance that only the faithful marked, fading in cultural relevance as church attendance declined. Instead, Easter expanded, absorbed secular spring celebrations, partnered with capitalism, and reinvented itself as a holiday that works on multiple levels. You can celebrate the resurrection, or just celebrate spring. You can attend church, or just attend brunch. You can fill Easter with deep theological meaning, or fill it with plastic eggs and call it a day. Modern Easter is confusing because it's trying to be everything, and somehow, impossibly, it mostly succeeds. It's sacred and profane, meaningful and trivial, ancient and thoroughly modern, a holiday that survived by refusing to choose what it wanted to be. Let's get morbid. When you die, your body begins decomposing immediately. Cells break down, bacteria spread, rigor mortis sets in. 3 days later, the timeline of Jesus' resurrection, you're bloated, discoloured, and very much dead. Resurrection, as described in the Gospels, defies every known biological process. No oxygen to the brain, no heartbeat, no neural activity, and yet life returns. Science says it's impossible. Faith says that's the point. Miracles, by definition, break natural laws. Easter asks believers to accept the impossible. For skeptics, it's a beautiful metaphor. For scientists, it's just no. Here's what happens in the first 72 hours after death, the period Jesus was allegedly in the tomb. Within minutes of your heart stopping, cells are starved of oxygen and begin dying. Brain cells go first, 4 to 6 minutes without oxygen, and they're irreversibly damaged. Within hours, rigor mortis sets in as muscles stiffen. Calcium floods muscle fibers, and your body locks into position. This peaks around 12 hours after death, then gradually releases over the next day or two. By day 3, you're past rigor mortis and entering active decomposition. Putrefaction begins as bacteria in your gut. no longer held in check by your immune system, start breaking down tissues. Gases build up. Methane, hydrogen sulfide, cadaverine, yes, that's its real name, causing bloating. Your abdomen swells, your skin discolors to greenish black, and fluids leak from orifices. This isn't pretty, and it's certainly not reversible. By the 72-hour mark, even if you'd been mistakenly declared dead, there's no coming back. Your brain is gone, your organs are failing, your body is decomposing. Resurrection at this point would require reassembling destroyed cells, reversing chemical breakdown, and restarting biological processes that have permanently stopped. Skeptics have offered natural explanations for Jesus' resurrection. Maybe he didn't actually die. He was taken down from the cross prematurely, appeared dead from shock and blood loss, but revived in the cool tomb. This swoon theory was popular in the 80th and 90th centuries, but it requires ignoring Roman execution expertise. Romans were professionals at killing people. They didn't accidentally let crucifixion victims survive. Plus, the Gospel of John mentions a soldier stabbing Jesus' side to confirm death, and medical experts note that the blood and water descriptions suggest cardiac rupture or pericardial effusion, signs of genuine death, not unconsciousness. Another theory, mass hallucination. The disciples, traumatized and grieving, experience collective visions of Jesus alive. Grief can cause powerful hallucinations. Widows report seeing deceased spouses, hearing their voices. Maybe the resurrection appearances were psychological, not physical. But hallucinations don't usually happen to multiple people, simultaneously seeing the same thing, and the Gospels claim Jesus appeared to groups, ate food, and invited physical touch. Hallucinations don't eat breakfast, or let you poke their wounds. Still, mass psychological events can create shared experiences that feel real, so the theory isn't entirely dismissible. Or the simplest explanation, the story isn't literal. Early Christians experienced something, spiritual visions, a sense of Jesus' continued presence, transformative encounters that felt like resurrection, and those experiences were later literalized into physical resurrection narratives. The empty tomb became metaphor turned history. The appearances became theology written as biography. This view allows the resurrection to be true spiritually without being true biologically. It's popular among progressive Christians, but anathema to traditionalists who insist that if Jesus didn't physically rise, Christianity collapses. Science can't prove resurrection didn't happen, just that it violates everything we understand about biology, physics, and chemistry. Dead cells don't regenerate. Brains without oxygen don't restart. Bodies 3 days into decomposition don't reverse course and walk away. If resurrection occurred, it was supernatural, an intervention by forces outside natural law. That's unfalsifiable. You either accept it on faith or reject it as impossible. Science has no tools for evaluating miracles because miracles, by definition, operate outside scientific principles. But here's what's interesting. The early Christians believed something happened that transformed them from hiding, terrified followers into bold public preachers willing to die for their claims. That transformation is historical. Whether it was caused by literal resurrection, spiritual experience, or elaborate deception, something convinced them Jesus was alive. And that conviction changed the world, launching a religion that spread across continents and lasted millennia. Science can't explain resurrection, but it also can't fully explain why millions of people believe in it despite it being biologically impossible. Easter sits in that uncomfortable space where faith and evidence collide, where the impossible is claimed as fact, and where belief persists regardless of what biology textbooks say. And 2,000 years later, we're still arguing about whether a dead body came back to life. That's not science. That's Easter. So tonight, as you drift off in your temperature-controlled bedroom, maybe spare a thought for the bizarre, beautiful, contradictory mess that is Easter. A holiday named after a goddess who may not have existed. A date calculated by moon phases and ancient compromises. A story of resurrection wrapped in symbols borrowed from pagans who just really liked spring. Eggs that don't come from bunnies, bunnies that don't lay eggs, chocolate shaped like both, sold by corporations that turned sacrifice into profit margins. Easter survived 2,000 years not because it stayed pure, but because it kept evolving. It absorbed everything in its path: pagan festivals, Jewish traditions, Germanic folklore, American commercialism. It bent, adapted and transformed with every century, every culture, every empire that tried to claim it. The church tried to control it, capitalism tried to sell it, and somehow both succeeded and failed at once. What we're left with is a holiday that's simultaneously about the most profound theological claim in Christianity, that death was defeated, and about marshmallow chicks that refuse to decompose. And maybe that's perfect. Maybe Easter endures precisely because it's everything to everyone. For believers, it's the cornerstone of faith, the day God proved love was stronger than death. For families, it's an excuse to gather, eat too much ham, and take photos of kids in pastel outfits. For children, it's eggs and candy and a bunny who makes even less sense than Santa, but is somehow more beloved. For historians, it's a fascinating case study in how religions absorb and transform the cultures they encounter. For skeptics, it's a reminder that humans have always needed stories about renewal, rebirth, and life emerging from death. Whether those stories are literal or metaphorical barely matters. The truth is, everything you thought you knew about Easter probably was wrong. But what's remarkable isn't the historical inaccuracies, or the pagan origins, or the commercial exploitation. What's remarkable is that Easter, in all its contradictory glory, keeps happening. Every spring, churches fill with people seeking meaning. Every spring, families dye eggs in kitchens, hiding them in yards while pretending a bunny did it. Every spring, grocery stores fill with chocolate and lilies, and we all participate in rituals we barely understand, following traditions whose origins we've forgotten, celebrating a holiday that's equal parts sacred and silly. Easter is a mess. It's theologically complex and commercially crass. It's deeply meaningful and profoundly absurd. It's resurrection and rabbits, crucifixion and candy, ancient Jewish sacrifice and modern American brunch. It's a holiday built on top of other holidays, a story told and retold until the original has been buried under centuries of reinterpretation, and yet every year it returns, like spring itself, like life after winter, like the very thing it claims to celebrate. So as you close your eyes tonight, surrounded by the quiet hum of modern comfort, remember that Easter, whatever it means to you, is a survival story. Not just the story of one man rising from a tomb, but the story of a holiday that refused to die, that kept reinventing itself, that absorbed pagans and Christians and capitalists and skeptics and somehow made room for all of them. Easter survived because it's flexible enough to mean many things, while still pointing towards something fundamental, the hope that death isn't the end, that spring always returns, that life is stronger than the forces that try to destroy it. Whether that hope is theological or biological, literal or metaphorical, doesn't really matter at 3 a.m. when you're trying to fall asleep. What matters is that humans have been telling this story in one form or another for thousands of years, and will probably keep telling it in new forms with new symbols for thousands more. So rest easy. Easter will return next year, same as always, different as ever. The bunnies will hop, the eggs will hide, the chocolate will melt, and somewhere someone will wonder why we do any of this. And the answer, as always, is complicated, contradictory, and kind of beautiful. Sleep well, And if you dream of marshmallow chicks that refuse to die, or bunnies delivering eggs they can't possibly lay, just remember, that's not weird. That's tradition. That's Easter. That's history being exactly as strange as it's always been. Good night.